democratise smart cities first, at least in a rudimentary way, and I've got a little video to show you. Just a short introduction, probably to tell you what you already know, but I think we need to start with some kind of common ground. And we know that smart cities are based on information communication technology, the Internet of Things. We know that it's there for managing assets of the city and to improve the quality of life. But returning to cities as phenomena, the city is the largest man-made organism, and I always say that it's never finished. It's always in a state of flux. In fact, London at the moment, you would believe, was more of a building site than a city for people to live in. And I think London, I don't know about Copenhagen, I've been there for a while, but I think London is at a crossroads. It's said to be one of the most livable cities in the world. And why? People say they love the parks, they love the low height of buildings, and feel that it has a quality of life that is unparalleled in Europe. It's also the largest city in Europe, the most advanced, attractive metropolis, where up until Brexit, Europeans wanted to come and actually become of age in their adult and professional life. But the luxury building boom, and there's a lot of that going on around here, is threatening all that, I would say, with gilt-edged piggy banks in the sky economy. All the gaps seem to be used up in London. So whereas London used to be considered the most creative city in the world, I feel that that kind of status is under threat. So now we're talking about smart cities, and maybe it's an access to return to some of the loose ecology that London was based on. And, well, smart cities, of course, sets out with a kind of technological possibility of integrating many what are separate networks at the moment. But it also has a proximity to issues around freedom, around the possibility of our every move being surveilled. And I just think that we need to plot a way through that to make sure that this is not just technology for its own sake, but it actually relates to the way people live, create in the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. I think that was super useful, as Nigel said. You know, we all know quite a lot of things about this stuff, but actually to set off from a common framework, I think is exactly the right thing. So thank you to Nigel for that. So I'm going to hand over to Leighton now to chair a panel and talk a little bit about the research perspective here. So over to you, Leighton. Oh, sorry, I do apologise. I'm missing you, Mark. Where are you? There. Sorry, I do apologise. Have the agenda in my hand. Forget all that. They'll come in a minute. I'm actually super pleased that Mark Walker has agreed to come and say a few words. So Mark Walker represents the London Mayor's international business programme, who are also supporting Smarter Cities now. So sincere apologies, Mark, for forgetting that. But over to Mark now. Thank you so much.
Really just wanted to say a few very quick words so we can get really on with the actual content and the actual moment of today. But just wanted to really thank Jeanette for actually inviting us to be part of this. The Mayor's International Business Programme was a programme that was founded a year ago by the Mayor of London to support London's fast-growing tech, urban and life science companies to internationalise and to take their products overseas. And one of the things that we've really needed to do as part of this is to work with other organisations such as Tech London Advocates and Tech Nordic Advocates to actually bring ecosystems together. And the way to actually do this within smart cities, well, the need to do this within smart cities is very high. As the name suggests, a city cannot do it on its own. It needs technology partners, it needs accelerator partners, and it needs many people to come together in an ecosystem and to share best practice. We recently run a trip to a few major cities in Europe over the last couple of weeks, taking in Berlin, also Paris, and to Madrid as well. And I personally led with the Deputy Mayor of London, Rajesh Agarwal, the Madrid Smart Cities section. We took 24 leading London companies out to Madrid and connected them in with the local city architectures, the local companies, and also the ecosystems as well. And we're really pleased to be working with Jeanette and Tech Nordic Advocates to do the same thing and join in with the trip in October to do a similar thing and take a bunch of leading London companies out to Copenhagen to share best practice and work within the ecosystem out there as well. And just also to mention on the same sort of lines, we are also returning to Spain in November to the Smart Cities Expo, which will be also taking a group of around 15 to 20 London companies to connect them with opportunities and partners within Spain. So I didn't really want to take up too much more time with that, but obviously I'll be around for the next day and a half. If any of you are London companies and want to get involved in the programme, please come and let me know. If there's anyone out there that thinks that they could be part of our ecosystem events, then I'd also be very interested to talk to you all as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. And we are obviously hugely honoured that the Mark and the Mayor's International Business Programme are supporting Smarter Cities now, so it's fantastic to have that support, and we can absolutely come up with companies that will be interested. So there are going to be some people arriving as well from Copenhagen later on today, Mark, so certainly they will come and talk as well. So that's fantastic. Now, thank you to Mark. Now it's Leighton and the panel. So over to you, Leighton. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Research agendas. What does that really mean? I think we're all sort of involved in some way in looking at the nature of the future of the city, but what's beyond our common agenda for what it could be in the West, in Europe. What is the city? The majority of people live in cities. I think we're on the verge of a 50-50 split. What about the rest of the world? What about the climate? How are we learning from those situations where people are making do or making better? And how do we bring them to our agendas or vice versa? So what I'm going to show you is a kind of an overview of the sorts of things that people are looking at in the extreme, where people are problematizing the situation to see where it might go and to see what you can get out of it in terms of solutions or questions, further questions that enrich the debate. So, having said that not everything's the same, some things are slightly extraordinary. They're green, they're big, and maybe they exist in the desert. Maybe you need a reason to make something as a barrier to all of that sun, to all that wind, to make a microclimate. Climate and technology. What are we doing with technology? How are we beginning to come to terms with what we can do to change the greater environment? Well, we've got some experiments which we're going to show you later in our hollow form of what that's like, what that could be like. So hopefully you'll see that when you go out for tea and coffee. But where and how do we find inspiration to begin to change some of these notions? Whether it be the body, or whether it be the notions of the clothes we wear, the things that I suppose enable our lives in the first instance, and enable our mobility, our understanding of structure, and how those things come together with a diverse range of people. Because things have changed. It's not the same people in the same places. Even in the UK, most people move toward the city. I think we all heard of Brexit. I think we all know the Democrats have voted. Isn't that part of smarter cities? So, how do you create them? How do you build them? Do we still build in the traditional sense, or do we rapid prototype and spray buildings together? What are the limits of that possibility? And how far should we go with bringing technology to bear on the reforming of the existing space? Perhaps the facades of our buildings might speak to us. I think we've had centuries and centuries of the flat window, the sunshade, but when the building can talk to you and you can own a piece of it, what does that look like? Hopefully we'll have a working model for you outside also by the end of the day. So these things are really crucial when looking at an extreme situation to give you the possibility of a new kind of solution. A building whose facade changes, that creates its own microclimate, that allows you to make options and choices as extreme as fish in the roof. Or buildings which adapt internally, almost like a brain, changing according to mood, need, and possibility, constantly being rebuilt until they're full, and then collapsing again. Until they're empty. So these are some of the possibilities for an extreme situation. And as we talk about what might happen in London, or what might happen in the Nordic states, we have opportunities to revisit our view. Of course, the music is optional, but the nature of the possibilities could suggest interesting consequences. So, the research here is to look at the practical applied research using technologies and notions of different cultural contexts in order to produce environments which might be reactive. Now, that's really interesting for a high-end sort of proposition. But what happens when you haven't got the economic clout to make something happen? Well, what you might do is you might produce infrastructure only, and you might begin to use areas of land that you would not normally use because of the cost of underpinning them or draining them. So this project looks at a sort of possibility in Brazil. Again, the notion of who are those people and what is the economic situation, but the creation of new districts around frameworks which re-enable the favelas and turn them into a new economic construct, not one which is waste, but one which is proactive, dynamic, and absolutely essential to the economy of Sao Paulo. So a structure is created, and then you give people an opportunity to take a lease on a floor and build it as they wish. As long as the common parts are kept the same. Change is a huge amount of things. Safety, the potential to make your own life in existence, but also a sense of equality. Those are some things that are really important, I think, in the notions of the smarter city, giving people a sense of inclusion. And also the way in which you arrange work alongside those possibilities. And the use of materials to enhance your sense of place, a market. So what might that be like as an inhabitant? That's something which people have been yearning for a long time in the last century. People are trying to make that real for themselves. So that kind of covers a little bit about the scaffolding and structure and living and working and enabling people who otherwise might not have ownership. And that leads me on to my last question, which is, what really does happen if global change continues? Well, there are some cities which are incredibly dense. Some places where people think nothing will ever change. But if you watch the Olympics, you may have seen this little bit of film. given, right? Can't get to play again. It's an area that's been flooded, and in 30 years, it won't be there. The city, the town, the smart, clever infrastructure, the rapid transport system, the lovely low-lying houses will be gone. And are we really thinking about that as a possibility? Or are we like Canutes, sitting on a throne, asking the tide not to come in? So, some of the other possibilities of what a smarter city might be a high-density enclosure. Something which grows rather more like something out of, I suppose, the more simpler structures in society. Something a bit like a body. A series of cells and openings. If you can curate as you wish, then begin to put together a full environment that comes and goes depending on time. But something which is resilient against those sorts of pressures of climate. And it could still be quite a pleasant place. I mean, things change. But that doesn't mean it's the end of the story. It doesn't necessarily mean desolation. Maybe things change again. But we have to think about other ways of using our planet's surface. Trying to see what the possibilities are and trying to feed some of those ideas back into what we might be, I suppose, teaching or preparing our students for the future. A lot of practices are interested in these sorts of notions also. One, because building high is a really good way of making a lot of money, but also because there are some really interesting possibilities with that, and interesting possibilities with making frameworks that people make use of themselves and change over time. So the research notions here are not simply about looking for the latest thing that looks nice, or the latest shape, or the thing that came off the rapid prototype machine. It's about asking questions about cultures, possibilities, and where we might be. Thank you. Now, I've got a distinguished panel of researchers with me, and they're each going to introduce themselves, and each of them is going to do a similar short piece about what they're looking at. And afterwards, we're going to have essentially a morning coffee party to talk about what we agree with and what we disagree with, and how we might come to resolutions or move forward in different directions. And my first academic is Carl Smith.
Hello. So, the slides. Sorry about that. So yeah, basically, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the research centre that I run at Ravensbourne. We're looking at hybrid technologies, mixed reality. We're looking at a broad spectrum of what augmentation can do, whether it's for architectural design or any form of technology-enhanced learning. We're looking beyond things like VR and AR to sensory augmentation, perceptual technologies, and we're looking to see how we can expand creativity and design thinking using these technologies. So we're moving from a stage of information communication to experience communication. I'll talk about a couple of projects that relate to this. But we're seeing an expansion in things like AR, which I believe is one of the killer applications, rather than VR. I think VR and a lot of technology tends to decry architecture, because we're just staring at screens. It doesn't seem to matter where you are. And as my colleague Jazz says, we've got to be making sure that technology is feeding us rather than bleeding our realities dry. And this is the sort of vision of horror that the only person happy in the room is Zuckerberg. With these sort of interventions. And I think we do have to be careful. I mean, this is sort of the opposite, where you are stuck inside architecture, but yet you're still not really engaging with the architecture, you're still engaging with screens. So these are some of our European projects. We started 3 big European projects, including Horizon 2020. But the focus of my talk today is mostly the CREAM project, which is a huge endeavour to look at all the creative industries and all the creative technologies and actually map the two. So look at which technologies actually will have impact on those industries. And we were in charge of the architecture sector. And it's actually an incredibly difficult process to try and get any group of people, especially architects, to sit down in a context like this and talk about how they use technology to actually change their field, because it's pretty much their competitive edge. So I think the European Commission knew we were up against it when we offered to do this project. But it was a fascinating one because of the context we've got at the AA, the Bartlett, etc. We did actually manage to come up with some very interesting results. This was the life cycle, so we went through a lot of conceptual research, desk-based research. And then we got all the interviews and we looked at all the big architectural firms all over Europe. And this was the process, so we're looking at visions, trends and weak signals, gap analysis, and then we came up with Jazz, an entirely new road mapping methodology that really saved the project. So these are some of the experts involved: Theodore at the AA, Minima Forms, Sean's a BIM expert, and Carlo's at MIT. This is one of the events we had at the AA in conjunction with Factory Futures. And again, it was a very, very interesting project because there is so much that technology can do for architecture, and I'll give another talk tomorrow about that specifically. But the big problem is that it's such a conservative field in lots of senses because it's so expensive. You've got so much regulation around it, it doesn't seem to matter how much innovation is potential because you've just got so much red tape. So, especially in a country like the UK, there's just so much regulation, so how do you really benefit from all the technologies that are out there? So these are some of the companies that we worked with that really are pushing technology in the industry. And these are some of the events that we organised. We also had a big event down at the Fab in Brussels. And these were some of the technologies and tools that we were identifying with these experts. And these were some of the techniques. And really interesting to see things like this from the MIT that's looking at how do we potentially control our own body temperature, potentially doing away with things like air conditioning. So technologies that can really transform architecture from the inside out. This is what it looks like. And another project we're looking at the moment is artificial senses. And how can artificial senses change architectural design? That's another thing that will come up tomorrow. This is the North Sense, which is something that you wear, but it actually creates a sense of north and knowing where north is. It vibrates every time you face north. And one of the big problems with the design of cities is not knowing where you are. But if you think about technologies like this, then actually you're enabling the complexity of how architecture can develop, because you will always know where you are with the technology you actually use. So some of the project issues was that we overpromised. Some of the other industries were much more difficult to get information from the experts. But it was a real interesting challenge, and ultimately these were some of the desirable futures, the visions that people were looking at. All these slides have been made available, so I'm going to just flick through a few of the visions. But some of the changing roles of architecture were really interesting, how people saw architecture evolving. For instance, using architecture as an enabling tool for greater social benefit, moving towards designing interfaces between authorities and the public instead of being limited to buildings, for example, pop-ups as interventions. The idea of natural building materials, biological and naturally based building materials. The need to expand modelling software to actually control material properties at the project stage. Looking at improving on the actual visualization side of the software and using things like VR, AR, whole mixed reality. But obviously architecture is a killer industry for things like mixed reality and AR. Rapid prototyping, and this was the ultimate real boon of the project, and this road mapping strategy is now being adopted in lots of other different contexts and different European projects. And there's a whole talk on that process, and you can look at that on Vimeo, that's the talk there. And I'll just mention one other project in the couple of minutes that I've got left. This is the big Horizon 2020 project that we just got €3 million to do. This project is actually trying to create a new form of media called wearable experience. And if you can imagine a surgeon doing surgery, we can now map a surgery in real time, make a 3D model on the fly of everything goes on in the surgery, and then we can map the surgeon's head movement, his eye movement, his hand movement, and his finger movement. And then with smart glasses and smart gloves, a novice surgeon could literally wear the experience of the surgeon. So we're talking about the architecture of people, the architecture of experience, standing inside somebody, the master-apprentice kind of a relationship. And we're working with 3 different industries. We're working with aeronautics, medical diagnostics, and we're working actually with astronauts. The trials start next week. We're about 15 months into the project, 36-month project. And our solution will be on the International Space Station. And we're creating IEEE standards out of the result of this work, and it has parallels with other projects that we're involved with. This is Mark Ferreira, who's going to wear the Oculus Rift and wear somebody's eyes for a month, and he'll also wear somebody's hearing for a month. He won't be outside of that architectural space. He won't be able to take it off. He'll wear it in his sleep, and he'll wear it in the shower, so it'll be a modified Oculus. So the reason why it relates to the Weekend project is because there's 2 aspects. So you've got an experience capture. So imagine the surgeon doing surgery, we're capturing that experience as much as we can. And then you've got the experience reenactment, and it's the same with Mark in the studio. He's going to be looking through somebody else's eyes, but somebody's going to be wearing cameras on their face and actually capturing their experience as best they can. So finally, just to mention, we will do demos of the Hollow Portal, which is just outside. And this is a nice bit of kit. Again, we're trying to create an Airbnb of bodies as opposed to an Airbnb of buildings. So looking at the body as a piece of architecture, it's basically a massive 3D scanner where you can produce and take content and put it into multiple contexts, whether it's film, animation, VR or AR. One of the big problems with VR and AR is not enough content's being produced. So there's a big content production tool for mixed reality. This is the world's first mixed reality fashion show, and it's a fascinating thing when you start to sort of enter architecture as an empty space, which then you augment with light. You know, you're turning matter into light with the Hollow Portal outside. So we are the future object, and I'm really interested in how we can become architecture ourselves, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Our next presenter is our Director of Research, Dr. Nick Lambert.
Okay, thank you very much, Leighton, and thank you very much, Carl. I think you've got a sense there of some of the projects we've started doing in this area, and my overview really is more about the sort of general sense of where the college sort of sees its research priorities, and you can see here they all link together in some way with either augmented or virtual reality, rapid prototyping, the Internet of Things and smart cities. So there's a thread running through there really about how do you both visualise and make concrete data, and how do you sort of interact with data, and how do you sort of move it into spaces outside the classroom and outside the building as well. We have actually worked with some European partners on the idea of smart cities for culture. And in fact, this was the type of network that we did last year in Florence with the city of Hamburg, the city of Florence, the universities from those cities, ourselves and several other partners. And here I think is one area of the smart city that needs to perhaps be sort of investigated further, is really what is the content that one can serve in the smart city. And in our case particularly, we were looking at the large amounts of digital data that museums, that galleries, that state archives and others have accumulated over the last 20 years as they've digitised their sort of large holdings. And really sort of asking, well, what is the point of all that if that data isn't sort of made public? And if you don't find a way to actually interface and interact with that beyond the confines of the screen. And the project that Hamburg were particularly sort of advanced with is a project called ePhoto, or also Smart Access to Culture in Digital Cities. And you can see here that they were proposing a much larger network that would have obviously involved Florence as well, and a network really to connect together through the cloud different archives in different places and make them sort of both geographically accessible to people in the streets, so that as you went through, say, Florence with an app, you'd be able to not only sort of see where you were, but also to link into local archives, local images, all the artworks and other things that were specific to that area, and also then gain some sort of sense of the history around you that was, as it were, sort of embedded in the buildings, in the geographical location, etc. And although that part of the project hasn't yet been funded, Hamburg themselves have a project called ePhoto. And ePhoto actually engages on a more local level with several specific locations in Hamburg and ties people there to the locality through the access to their archives and their history. And what is interesting here is that ePhoto encouraged people with private archives of historic photos and other historic data to contribute to things that the state is doing at a larger level as well. So that really sort of integrates the individual and the council and other places too. So I'm most interested to see really what this sort of concept of digital culture can mean, but also bringing this visual angle to the smart city. This has influenced us in our work with some of our local partners, for instance Visit Greenwich, the local tourist agency. In conjunction with them and with interest from the National Maritime Museum and other places, we are in the process of developing some VR experiences that do some of what ePhoto does on a much smaller scale, but perhaps involving some of the landmarks around these sites, and really trying to create a sense of what it means to be a World Heritage Site with specific nodes and specific places where you find more interest and local culture. And that, of course, plugs us into Digital Greenwich. Obviously, we have a lot of contacts with them. We're doing quite a lot of work across the way in Mitre Passage, and evolving some more European-facing projects while we still have a time to apply for them before the final sort of curtain falls on EU partnerships. And that also involves then a broader sense, really, what the smart city might deliver in terms of council services, in terms of tying together different deliverables there. That also is engaged with the Gateway project. Several of our architectural students were in a competition to look at new transport solutions and also think about ways to redesign the peninsula around future modes of transport. And that was a recent project that we had. And just to say, things that Carl has already pointed to in terms of our other interests in VR as well, and some of the ways that we've reached out there too. But I'd like to touch on a personal interest, and that's the Data Dome in Bristol, because I'm sure that many of you know about the Bristol is Open project, a collaboration between Bristol City Council and the University of Bristol, partners like NEC, and the Future Cities Catapult. And in the context of the wider attempt really to tie up the sort of central ring around Bristol using the university supercomputer, feeding back a lot of data from points in the streets, especially in air quality, on transport, etc. As part of that, the dome, the planetarium in the Millennium Square, has been which is called At Bristol, has been refurbished as a so-called data dome. And that is to make it serve as a live point of visualization, so that you can actually do 360-degree visualizations of the city using data incoming from various sources. And the intention is that that should serve to influence policy making, that you can actually then tie together a sort of a heat map of the city. You can sort of see these things in real time, and basically sort of turn it into a node and for the sort of decision makers of Bristol to actually come and see the impact that some of their decisions might be having on the city. So, I mean, this sort of potential for using fully immersive technology, which is actually of a slightly different nature to being sort of locked into a headset. I mean, my personal preference is to be in sort of spatialized virtual environments rather than ones which sort of tie you into sort of a small letterbox-sized sort of worldview. And I think that this actually has a great deal of potential elsewhere in terms of trying to sort of make the smart city real. And not only sort of being sort of out, to, you know, sort of delivering the smart city in a sort of in the sort of urban context, but also making you understand its ramifications and the way it's put together. You can see here that Bristol is also sort of moving ahead in the Internet of Things. But it's actually a very difficult thing to visualise really what data looks like and how data operates around us. I'm quite interested in this art project by Richard Wiegand called The Architecture of Radio. Here you can see you take a tablet, and it'd be easier to show you the film, although we don't really have time. But by moving the tablet around your local space, it actually identifies local Wi-Fi routers. It sees really where they are. It tries to sort of make concrete, or make visual at least, the waves and their sort of transmission through the world around you. It isn't entirely accurate. There's a certain amount of artistic license, but really it helps you to see that your space is actually filled with other types of radiation and data, and enables you to understand really where these are actually emanating from, and also how you sort of step through these different fields. And I quite like this just as sort of a touch point from the past about making information concrete, that the Inuit in Greenland use pieces of driftwood to actually create small maps of the coastline. And not only are they sort of, as it says, small enough to be carried on a mitten, but they can also be, they're compact, they're buoyant, and they can be read in the dark, because it's something that's actually very tactile rather than necessarily just visual. But you can also see there how they relate to the coastline as well. So there's something there about sort of taking data from the outside world and making it into something concrete, as also the artist Peter Yelich has done with his Bleecker Street documents. He's actually visualising his local Wi-Fi networks, but this time as 3D prints. And finally, also Nikolai Lamb's What If You Could See Wi-Fi project. I've always been particularly fond of this, taking shots from around Washington DC and superimposing them onto that how the Wi-Fi fields would look as you sort of walk around the major buildings of the US government. And really he's also trying to show really the amplitude of the waves. He's trying to sort of show sort of idealised Wi-Fi data transmitted over a band that's divided into different channels, shown in red, yellow, green and other colours. And you can even sonify this. This is Mario de Vegas Dolmen, which actually uses high-frequency receivers and scanners to sort of project sound based on location, which also sort of describe the local Wi-Fi fields as well. So the point is, you can see Lamb, it says the goal of the pictures isn't clinical accuracy, but he wished to inspire, showing what Wi-Fi would look like if we could see it, and we'd appreciate the technology that we use every day. And then, of course, the smart city, coming back to that, is actually how do you actually visualise what the smart city does, how it affects you, and how you sort of walk through it as well. But I will finish with a small provocation. Shannon Matten did a very interesting article recently called A City is Not a Computer. And in that, she looks at the work particularly of Lewis Mumford and considers what are we actually doing when we describe space in terms of information. And are we trying to reduce down to a certain level the complexity of space, the complexity of the interactions that happen with it, and the embedded knowledge that exists in different places, if we just say, well, actually, we can not only sort of sample that, but also just represent that in various data-driven ways, and then use that to define and, in fact, direct what the city might be. And she says about Mumford that he would reject the creeping notion that the city is simply the internet writ large. And the idea that information takes many forms, many of these things can't actually be represented as digital data. Not only how could you encode those things, but also is it wise to, and to what degree could that level of control be useful or desirable? So leaving that there and thinking about the nature of the virtual and the real, I'll now hand over to Alison.
I was pleased to see that final set of slides from Nick, because for some time now I've wondered what kind of a contribution I could possibly make to this conference. My attitudes basically are rather old-fashioned. So what I'm going to do is talk about space on the one hand, and space being something that we treat as if it were objective in some sense. It's all part of architecture. But when you look at the work of somebody like Adrian Forty, he has made us aware of the fact that the term space only appears in literature at the end of the 19th century and only really appears in architecture as a common form of discourse in the early part of the 20th century. So this idea that space is something that we're used to and is always there is something that I think one has to be rather careful of. Now, the other thing that was in Nick's presentation was the possibility that all of the interest that we have in smart cities, smarter cities, leads to a form of reification. A reification of all this information into physical forms that become binding rather than enabling and free. So what I'm going to do now is go through my research, which I hope isn't too obtuse to the conversations today, but it's about the way that architecture was involved in what I call the reification of order.
What's reification?
To make something concrete which is otherwise organizational or relational, abstract in that sense. Now, this all relies on the notion, again, a term that was used by Nick, of paradigmatic shifts. And in overall, in European history, we could say there have been three in terms of our intellectual work. First of all, we had a period of orality, and then a period of literature, of literacy. Orality and Literacy was the title of a book by Walter Ong. And now we're in an age of the internet and of electronic transmission of information. Well, this is a text from the period of the transformation from orality to literacy. And you can see that it's from a text called Grammatography, and it's a list of grammar. This is grammatical terms and their significance. This was the result of transformations that took place in the 13th century in education, dependent largely on a book by Peter of Spain, which was the first grammar to be published. Why did this happen? Well, it was the beginning of the opening up of trade in the European continent. And the problem was that there weren't enough people around who could write contracts and take care of accountancy. So it's a problem which we now have again in finding people who manage the technology of this new age that we're entering. This meant that there had to be a radical transformation of education at the time. You suddenly had a large number of people being educated, whereas previously there were very few. Previously, education took the form of an oral exchange. You sat and talked to people, and by the time that you had been there for a number of years, you acquired their fluency in the use of language. That was no longer possible. So people had to learn how to write, and how to write correctly, quickly, but perhaps not so elegantly. And that's where the study of grammar, rhetoric, and so on, in a formal sense, began. And what happened as a result was the production of any number of images that were put into texts that were used for education. Images had not taken place before in education. It was strictly a text-based activity. But these images that we see here were the beginnings of the notion in modern European life of the importance of visual material. And you can see from this one, with the way things are overlaid and so on, that there's an implicit three-dimensionality to it. Certainly not called space, but here we have one that was supposed to be the geometry of the mind. In other words, it was supposed to be an image of the way the mind worked. There was a belief at the time that to communicate, you had to emulate the structure of the mind and the way that you constructed your verbal discourse. And on that basis, there was a continuity of understanding through structure, something that could be represented visually. And there are a variety of different diagrams that you can find from that period. Well, the architectural theorist Alberti wrote a couple of texts, one on sculpture, the other on painting. And in this, he came up with a proposal for aesthetics that lasted from that period up until the 19th century. In the 19th century, aesthetics changed again, but it was this basic diagram that persisted over that period. And the writer Michael Baxendale has indicated that he feels that Alberti discovered this proposal for aesthetics by looking at the way that grammar had been taught. And grammar had been taught that you had an arborescent or tree structure to the way that we communicate. And we have, that goes from period or sentences, is another word for it, clause, phrase, word. In other words, if you want to say something that is coherent and meaningful to other people, it has to follow this structure. And the period, the sentence, has to make sense in some way, and it's made up of these individual parts, and they are part of a continuous whole. This was the beginning of the idea that there was something about the totality of composition which made sense, and that it was something that had to be embedded in the work of creativity. Alberti transferred this to the notion of a painting, where he said you have a picture, and that picture is made up of bodies, which would be human in this case, and they're made up of members, etc., hands, fingers, and so on. And when you paint it, you have the various planes of color that you put on the painting, so that there is a hierarchy between the artistic expression and meaning, which is continuous and unavoidable. Yeah, okay, right. Well, that's the way that you can explain this Earth Venus, by working between the various elements that make up the bodies there, the paint that's applied, and the basic meaning. Very quickly now. Brunelleschi followed the same diagram in the way that he invented his principles of architecture, and Brunelleschi is the beginning of the modern tradition in the West. You can see in this building here how all the parts connect to each other and make for a coherent whole. And this is finally realized in Santa Spirito, which generally speaking is the first building that is said to represent this notion of a building created around a universal space that has a completely integrated space, which has nonetheless a hierarchy of parts. And if we just quickly go back to this, you can see that it's all based on a gridded system. So this is the beginning of the idea of space in the West, that is somehow universal. It doesn't have a hierarchy within it, but it can express a hierarchy, and that this is the basis for an opening up and freedom and equality of the experience within it. And then very quickly, Leonardo, at the same time, roughly, came up with these series sketches of these centralized churches, which were laterally used by Bramante in his proposals for St. Peter's. You can see on the left how the St. Peter's has a kind of embeddedness of the centralized buildings in the radiating parts, and also this notion of a grid that runs through it to the creation of this, not exactly a building, but a city. His ideas for St. Peter's were that it should be, in a sense, a city. And that's where this little presentation ends. There's a distinction to be drawn between buildings and cities. Cities are something which are more coherent, and which are indicated here. Cities were too expensive to make, so St. Peter's was turned into a building. And we find out repeatedly that cities, if they're properly constituted as spaces that we have in some integrated, meaningful way, get costed out of existence. And we are reduced to working with individual sites that have their own economies. I'll leave it there. The thing that I think I was struck by so far today is that we haven't had any quantity surveyors come in to tell us of what's going to be affordable. And a quantity surveyor looking at the kinds of structures that are proposed for cities of the future would point out basically the redundancy of the basic materials going into it.
Thank you, Dr. Featherstone. I suppose it begins to, these three presentations talk about the interweaving of phenomena. The phenomena that make a city more than just a series of buildings, but ideas, pleasures, delights, and questions. And now, we'll hand over to Idris Rasuli. He's going to talk about the possibility of innovation with all of the things that we've seen so far. Idris Rasuli.
Right, good morning. fascinating stuff here. I'm just going to talk about a few things that I've been involved with. I was just talking to some students yesterday that a lot of major ideas actually happened in the 1980s. And what we're actually doing now is the possibility that we can actually make those ideas happen. So we have the material, we have technology to get those ideas happening. And I'm going to talk about what's not really about architecture, and it's not really about the everyday, but it's what actually makes the cities, and that's the food that we actually eat. And it's also the trade that brings people together. What is X-Crop? Well, I founded this company to kind of looking at revolutionizing the future of what we do in terms of energy, food, water, and all of that, cultivating inside the cities. And I'm going to talk to you about the fourth generation of agriculture. So why do we need to look into that? What is so important when we look at the smarter city, not just the smart city, because smart city already happened in the early 2000s. And now we're looking at how we can make things smarter. We all know that population growth, we know that at some point it will become about 7 to 8 and also 9 billion people living in cities. And majority of that, 4.5 billion of that, will be middle class people. People like us in this room, who actually go about our life every day, and we're going to be living in those cities. And so, which means that the need for everyone, the world will need to produce 70% more food in those cities. The cities are actually becoming the global cities. And according to Norman, he's quite a famous economist, he says that in the next 40 years, farmers will have to grow as much as what we've grown in the past 10,000 years if we want to feed these people in the next 30 or 40 years' time. So how do we do that? We have an amount of land, and we only can grow as much as the land can produce. So amount of food that was grown in the 8000 BC, the yellow then kind of shows what actually is being grown today. And the red line kind of shows what we can grow on the planet, on the earth that we have. And the green is actually what we have to produce if we want to feed all these people in the future. So population growth plus increase in demand times by limited arable land and limited arable or available water. So how do we go about it? And we're still doing this. We're still doing what we used to do 8,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago. We still grow the same way. A lot of cities actually grow. And in the UK, we also grow like this, majority. We still use the same type of process, the water. We also still grow the same type of crops. And we have just kind of started looking at this, which is hydroponics, aeroponics. And we do it in a manner that actually we are, again, using land. We are actually building buildings to make these things happen. Why do we do that? We're using kind of artificial lighting. Again, it's not really giving us what actually should be, which is the natural ingredients coming from the sun and water. And also, kind of, what is a social need? This whole process of growing, bringing things fresh, enjoying that, creating a trade, creating a new kind of means of living. And so also the way we've looked into cities actually have somehow changed the way we do things. So we kind of deforested a part of land. We then started looking at growing things, making villages, growing that into cities. And again, cities taking out our growing or actually our arable land out of where we live. And this is what's happened. We're looking at kind of infrastructure of people living and working, cities becoming this, and also contaminating that land. So once that city is gone, for example, we try to move or grow that city, what happens to that land? can we actually grow on that land? All of these kind of findings takes us to one thing, climate change. And I believe Leighton kind of triggered that earlier on. How much do we talk about these things? And how much do we talk about sustainability? And how do we deal with those matters? And again, we know that climate change is going to happen. It's happening now. So currently it's happening in Somalia, Sudan, and all these countries. Slowly, the whole kind of in a journey of what's happening in those countries will kind of go through the other countries as the weather gets hotter. So why the fourth generation of agriculture? So what we're doing currently is looking at testing new agricultural practices and how we can actually make it more sufficient and mostly kind of in numbers available for people living in cities. So the first one was about how we can actually sustain ourselves, growing for that. Then we looked at industrial agriculture. Then we're currently looking at vertical. So what is the fourth one? Why not use the ocean, which is 70% of the earth? Why not grow on that? So the big idea, again, we know about this thing about where actual coastal cities will be flooded. We know that's happening, ice melting. But what are we doing about it? We also know that there are 18 mega cities in the world out of 21 that are actually coastal. So what are we doing about that? So land price. Looking at those major cities, what are the land costs in those cities? So looking at Karachi in Pakistan, which is the lowest, all the way to Tokyo, which is the highest. Again, it's not really giving us enough to make a business out of that growing in the city, even if it's vertical. And also the food miles, how is that working? So at X-Crop, what we're looking at, a new way of growing things called sea leaf. And this is kind of looking at the problem, which is food security, but also food miles, and how we can actually look at opportunities with this. So this is what we're currently looking at in terms of research. This is what we're working on. It has been going on for about 2.5 years. It's a collaboration between X-Crop and also countries like the Maldives, looking at how we can actually test these. And it's looking at floating platform on the water. They can actually grow using hydroponics. And it's actually looking at what we have existing in terms of technology, not really reinventing a technology, but bringing in the technology to create a new means of growing on water. So again, this device costs about £80 currently in the business plan. And so it kind of looks into a number of ways of growing on water. It creates a new means for people actually practicing, such as fish farming and so on. So we're kind of looking at cities like Singapore, where they actually bring in 95% of their food. And what we can actually grow if we use sea leaf, and what is really needed in that context, and how we can actually look into growing these right next to where people live. They can actually grow, take, and also use. And also kind of putting onto the existing infrastructure, how we can actually leverage on that, how we can actually use what's there in order for this to happen. So as I said, in terms of who's going to be using this, who's going to be actually benefiting from it, so existing case, people actually looking into fish farming, but also this other side of things, the next generation of farmers. Everyone in the future perhaps not going to be so much into everything that we do today. They might be interested in much more natural means of growing things and eating things. Some key benefits, again, improving future food security is one, but in the meantime, providing fresh within the context. And this is still happening. This is kind of like looking into traditional means that's currently taking place in places like Bangladesh, Thailand, Cambodia. And it's also looking into using the actual ocean water. So as we know, flooding, all the ingredients in the world, the best ingredients are actually in the ocean. So it's also looking into using those ingredients as it's actually being deployed. Just kind of looking into the vision of this. It's actually a city on the water. So you're actually having an experience of this thing on the water. So what we're proposing is almost 1/5 of what's going to be costing in terms of the future of these cities. So X-Crop is looking at providing 8 yields per year within 1 meter square for about £800 within the cities. So we are kind of looking into this. Currently, this is research going on, as I said. But there are some challenges. Challenges being that how do you deal with the waves? How do you deal with the actual growth of this? How do you deal with the living inside this pontoon or this structure, such as fish and so on? How do you deal with that? So thank you.
Thank you, Idris. I'm going to ask all of our panel members to come to the front and take a seat. We're going to have a little discussion about some of these notions and the integration of the questions. Because I think we haven't really talked about your town smarter city, and that comes later. But there are some bigger questions that this all sits into. Questions about culture, about the notions of the idea of the city, the notions of how we grow, how we live in the future, and a changing world. So, colleagues, if you'd like to join me at the front, thank you. Professor Coates. So the agenda was first set about what is a smart city. So a really interesting film from Professor Coates about the nature of it. And you said some interesting things about the question about what smart city could be. And is it just that? Could you say a little bit more about the other things which are beyond simply eating, living, going to work? The notion of the culture of the city and its potential to drive the development.
Well, I've enjoyed what we've seen so far, and particularly yours with your historical references to notions of space. But I guess what's been going through my mind is the role of kind of subcultures and objections to the status quo. So I'm seeing it sort of playing out as a question of power, as to who is in control of these smart cities. Is it IBM? Is it the government? Is it GCHQ? And where is the room for going beyond simply being a consumer? I think that's one of the biggest dangers of the present, is the consumification of everything, including social media, and much of our experiences are like we become addicted to social media. So I'm looking for the capacity to stimulate original action and original thought within the context of these technologies being at its service.
So these are notions, the city is a political creature, or one which has lost its ability to be a political creature.
Well, political, of course, is, we're in a political moment right now where there's a sort of disjunction between the democratic system we live within and how citizens feel they're connected to that.
In a sense,
but I'm not necessarily only talking about democracy and the expression of power through that route, but also the expression of power, the commanding of power through the control of the networks which we subsequently use, such as Google, for example.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm just thinking along these lines. This was the part of what I was going to present that I didn't get to because I ran out of time.
I thought you were.
Yeah.
I thought you were leading to that.
The issue for me is, I guess it's twofold. On the one hand, digital media do not allow us to experience space. If it's sat-nav, we experience a set of instructions that is sequential. It's a fragmented, shattered narrative. The other thing is about the ability to create new things, culture and so on, in our cities. Now, I suppose that the point of the historical references is that when you create these spaces that were there in the Renaissance, they enabled you to sense the presence of where you were. You were actually there as a person, interrelating with others in a rather more haphazard way. These days, we have very discrete text messages that get sent back and forth. And so what happens, I believe, is that communication becomes something like displacement activity, where it's in place of the ability to communicate on a more dynamic way. It becomes entirely measured. It gets registered. It gets saved. It's a completely different type of human existence than we've been used to for many centuries now.
But the Renaissance idea of the town is easy to glamorize, but it was quite a kind of risky environment, wasn't it? Whether you were at the top or the bottom.
Oh, yes.
You could easily get stabbed in the back and robbed of all your money.
Yeah. I mean, not even in the
much
back.
has changed then, really, has it?
Well, no, not in that sense. But the thing is that these spaces were created, and people did interact in that way in those spaces. I think that today, we saw it today in the graphics, you know, the blood coming out and going into the phone. Good image. And you see groups of people sitting around, not talking to each other, talking into their phones. So that's why I say displacement activity is what I think it largely results in. And to me, the question is, how do you overcome that?
Exactly.
If I look at the essays that students have turned in this year, and a large number, when they talk about smart cities, what they talk about is eulogizing consumerism and control. And it's not architecture. It's about something that avoids what architecture's been about. It avoids the notion that there's a common ground in any way that we inhabit. They're not actually inhabiting anything. They're engaged in this strange activity to me.
I mean, just to follow on from that, I mean, it's interesting to look back about 20 years, firstly to the rise of the internet, but also to the first sort of boom in virtual reality, which I'm sure some of you will remember back in the mid to late 90s. And there was research done really into how the use of spatial metaphors had actually sort of made their way into a virtual space, and how much it was informed by things like the idea of a chat room or the digital frontier, that sort of thing, the sort of sense that you're actually taking over a sort of an unknown but sort of spatialized territory. And I think it's interesting to see how much that has perhaps gone on to affect what smart cities are as well. I mean, the idea that somehow one maps to the other, that there's a sort of a geography of the data which actually maps somehow onto the sort of physical geographies as well. But in terms of creativity, and I think especially in terms of culture, we've always seen that it gravitates towards certain sort of key points. And that's often due to the availability of certain sort of features, you know, perhaps affordable places for artists to congregate, for instance, places where, sort of particular groups have sort of historically moved to, places like Soho, for instance. I'm involved with a project called the Museum of Soho, which is actually a virtual museum, brought together really by the gradual pushing out of a lot of Soho's traditional culture by Crossrail, by the sort of redevelopment that's going on there. And what's interesting is that they've actually been forced perhaps to use virtualizing technology to capture something which has rapidly disappeared. I think of the colony rooms, I think of places like that, and they've really preserved those as 360-degree photographs of necessity, really, because the actual places assumed to sort of, they're now objects of memory. They're no longer places you can actually visit apart from seeing the exteriors, because the interiors have been swept away.
You're saying that much of that experience is displaced to the point that it's completely intangible compared with the original experience.
Yes.
And you can't really get drunk in a digital space, can you?
Of course not. No. You've just got the ghost of the memory. Yes, I mean that's. And the question is, where can you now get drunk? You know, in that sort of sense, and you'll find that very obviously it's been displaced to other fringes. You know, but we see this sort of process, gentrification, obviously going on all the time. But I think it's interesting that perhaps in the face of that, we displace some of that also into the digital domain as well. We sort of push ourselves out.
Just to add to that, I mean, I'm really interested in this idea of, technology and architecture, and how do we change the way we perceive as architecture? How do we change the way we perceive space and that becoming its form of architecture? We've been sort of bogged down by linear perspective for 500 years. It's the oldest technology we have. It's invented by an architect to sell buildings, but it's infiltrated all our image-making technologies. All our cameras are based on linear perspective, all our films are based on linear perspective, and it's time to really hack into the way we perceive space. What happens to architecture when we can all see in 360? When we adopt 360 vision, what changes about the way we perceive architecture?
And there's an interesting sort of question that goes with what's on the screens if you have a look around. Now these are questions people are dropping at us from all over the place. But there are two other themes that run alongside the culture themes. And one is renewal, which seems to be coming out of this. Progressive cities, what helps startups, what makes change, what do we do with what we have? And also the more radical notion of the new city, the city on the surface area we never use, the city of the ocean. And I'm interested to know how that kind of ties up with some of the notions you're talking about. If you could pass the microphone to Idris, perhaps he might make a comment about that.
I think, just to add to the question earlier, I think what is quite interesting is to look at these cities that are actually coming out of the much more emerging cities. For example, the 100 smart cities of India, and the relationship of culture. So the main question about government controlling all that is that in countryside, in those countries, you're not really in the system. But the idea is that once you actually come to the city, you're in the system. So I think we have already accepted as people in the city that you're already in the system, and you have to accept that you're being watched in a sense. But also kind of coming up on the question about city on the ocean, is this idea about, okay, why can't we actually look into, instead of kind of building upon the land that we have, or against the problems that are coming or arising, why can't we actually go onto that land? So yeah.
And an interesting point is this, your ideas have huge impacts for every city that's on the coast. Because every city on the coast now, potentially, is a really rich city. It's a really rich and powerful city, not simply by means of normal kinds of communication, by airplane or whatever, but because it has the food supply on its doorstep. It changes radically our relationship to the coast and to the environment. And that's a clear, important, different step. But also in the existing city, this notion of renewal, what is it that we do with that? With an influx of people coming to the city, what do we do to re-emerge the notion of the local, the notion of the community as a group of people who might have something in common that might make something distinct?
I just want to add to that is for example, this thing about what people, the screen and so on, so the interaction. And so again, the airport's being part of the city, being built next to where we live. But at the same time, we're not really thinking about this whole thing about how people interact with culture and how they actually socialize. So, yeah.
I think that when you're talking about completely new cities, such as unoccupied, what are we looking at? What do you want to stare at?
Yeah, excuse me, those spaces, the church, the one-way communication, plans for massive population. How can that be an inspiration for the future?
Well, I have noticed that there isn't a church on the British Peninsula. I think we should build one. Maybe it's not the normal church, but it needs a spire. And I just wanted to add that if you're talking about building completely new cities, I think it needs the equivalent of the old things in the existing cities. That whenever we see a presentation of some kind of idealistic, perfect, totally digitally created city, it makes my heart sink. Because it has no layering, it lacks complexity. it lacks the different reaction to a new building or a new situation an old one. And I think as cultural beings, we need that kind of differentiation.
If I could just answer that third point that was up there. A few hundred years ago, it wasn't just a one-way ticket that you had in churches. Churches were also used as places of business. They were essentially where you went to trade, barter, and so on. So there might be a religious service in the nave, but in the aisles there'd be people doing all kinds of different things. The point is that there was beginnings there of what I showed you, of the idea that space is something that's defined by a series of neutral gridded structures, and that's some hundreds of years before Descartes. So that, just to that particular point, one thing I just wanted to mention, and that was the objection, well, not the objection, but the impediment to the exchange of ideas and development amongst architects, anyway, I suspect amongst a lot of other people as well, is competition and protecting your privileged information. In the examples that I mentioned at the very beginning, the growth of literacy in Europe was basically something to do with the elites. They wanted to train people. There were no copyright issues. There were no patents. There was no intellectual property. If you had information, you could teach it, you got paid for it. And then you were able to go out and do business. And everybody wanted to do that, so it just simply happened. These days, people want to have control over the potential functionality of their inventions and what they've learned. And that completely limits the possibility of things expanding in anything like an organic pattern.
Just to go back to what Nigel said about the layering of new cities, or the lack thereof, I mean, it's something I've always felt going across the water to Canary Wharf. It's a place where, just speaking personally, I often find myself a bit disoriented because there don't seem to be any particular landmarks as such. I mean, you can wander around looking at very, very generic and very similar buildings for a long time, of course, apart from the tube station and things. It really does seem to be a space that sort of lacks a lot of these sort of geospatial sort of targets that one would expect perhaps from an older city. And I think also in the Greenwich Peninsula we see something of a tabula rasa. There's a sense that it's sort of being built sort of out of nothing, and that it's just being sort of laid on the earth, and as these buildings spring up around us we wonder, well, what's the actual geography or pattern, how is that sort of going to be sort of reflective of what actually goes on here. So no, I feel strongly about that, and I think it's something that a lot of people using visualization software tend to sort of implement sort of fairly generic looking buildings. We ought to think about how perhaps to differentiate them more.
Right now, I'm happy to take questions from the audience if there are any. At all? Or just going to take them from the screen? Let's take them from the screen. So, how can we help startups initiate real projects in cities? The roles of CIOs in US cities and new technology. That's going to become a recurring theme, I think, for the conference. How do we help small startups make a difference? And what's the kind of difference that we think that they can make? Carl?
I think what we need from a lot of this stuff is we need to basically be aware that even with Horizon 2020, there's so many startups that get involved in even things like AR, and there's a massive problem with VR and AR at the moment because people are saying, how can we save VR? You know, a lot of these companies get involved and they start making their own headsets. There's a big disjunct between people that think VR's everyone's jumping on the bandwagon, but ultimately it's a big problem because a lot of people are talking a lot of nonsense about VR, and a lot of people jump on the bandwagon, including a lot of startups that get involved with big projects, and they all fall by the wayside because a lot of the problem with VR is people don't have the experience of trying on headsets, and they're even saying now that we need to have the arcade will save VR because people need the experience before they actually will buy the headsets. So I think it's a case of really identifying needs from startups, identifying real gaps in the market, and actually making sure that you're not using technology to solve problems that don't exist, but actually looking at human needs.
Interestingly, the way in which VR and AR is used to begin to describe spaces, how does that impact on the making of spaces? I think there's a kind of there's a disjunction between the two things. There's the thing you look at, you think it's interesting, but how could that impact on making cities smarter? Certainly it's about experience.
I think it depends partly on the technology of vision that we're using, whether we sort of tend to see things on a flat screen or in surround in some way. And I think that, you know, perhaps as Carl said earlier, we become somewhat impoverished in the sense that we tend to perceive the world through the camera or through a sort of perspective that's given to us by that sort of single point perspective of old. I think so long as it's always tied into one's understanding of space and actually sort of being immersed in the physical, then, to my mind, the digital can be appended to that in some way, that the digital obviously has an existence of its own, but we should always remember how does it relate back to the world that you'd be navigating either sort of on foot or by car or whatever, a space in which you also inhabit. And I think trying to sort of pin down what it is that sort of see... I think a lot of architecture in many ways tends to be flat, and so, you know, that we perhaps in sort of earlier times, especially in terms of the way the Renaissance understood space, it was much more of a three-dimensional thing. And I wonder if there's some way to bring that back.
But have we forgotten about art in the 20th century? I mean, the whole point of the avant-garde of Cubism and Pointillism and God knows how many other isms was to relay the fact that we could see in many different ways at the same time. And I think that, you know, that's one of the better sides of our present world, is that we're able to think and operate in different strata simultaneously. So I disagree with you about our being forced to see the world through a single point perspective.
Could I just mention a sort of darker image? A few years back, I went to a conference that was set up by Architects for Health, a sort of group in London, and it was on retirement homes. They showed some wonderful Finnish examples of these people sitting around enjoying each other's company and all this sort of thing. And then there was a presentation by two people from the government who claimed to be members of the new generation of electronically literate people who didn't need to meet other people on a sort of incidental social basis. They were perfectly in touch through the internet, and all they needed was to text others to tell people if they needed some sort of medication or if they needed their food or whatever, and they could all live isolated at home and be perfectly happy. And this meant that it wasn't going to be necessary to build all the retirement homes that would be otherwise necessary for the aging population that tends to live longer than we used to. So there's, to my mind, the anxiety that comes in with the smarter city paradigm, if you like, is that it does tend to offer governments a cheap way out to turn us into monads that are existing somewhere completely independently of the rest of the human race, except for functional requirements and necessities defined by law.
I certainly think in the vocabulary of the smart city you often find the word efficiency, and I think that efficiency is precisely what Richard talks about, is that sort of idea of streamlining or perhaps sort of trimming down or reducing the need for contact, and I think that's a very real danger.
Just one more point. I mean, I'm really interested in how do we stop the silification of all of these contexts, and how do we context engineer rather than content engineer? And how can we allow architecture to actually merge contexts that normally wouldn't get merged, like this idea where you can merge a primary school with a nursing home, to allow both contexts to totally flourish in ways that we'd never normally see with this siloed world?
Interesting. There is another sort of point that's come out of here, top one. It's something which came out, I think, as a notion, perhaps in the 60s, and grew to an idea that as the economies of cities grew, cities themselves would become states. What do you guys think about that? Are cities going to become more important than states, given the current situation?
I was going to say, but I'll quickly talk about America, because I read an interesting article recently that said, well, looking at the voting patterns of the recent election there, obviously there was a sense that Trump got a lot more from rural or from sort of Midwestern voters, etc. Whereas the larger and more productive populations of the centre, of the cities, although they sort of represent in many ways the engine of America's economics, in effect have a lesser voice because of the sort of shape of the electoral college. And in fact, saying that in fact in some ways the more important sort of populations do not yet have that sort of thing. But I think we will see actually that these sort of discussions will probably foment, as has happened here in London in regard to Brexit, and the idea, however feasible it is, to actually create a zone where in fact London, having voted Remain, would actually still attract, still retain freedom of movement, etc. But there might be some mechanisms by which cities might start to detach themselves from the heartlands. And I think certainly lots of discussion in the UK has gone into the fact that London is that much bigger of an economy, population-wise, etc., than other regions within the UK as well. So I think, yes, we will see this happen de facto, and it will be a return to the sort of earlier times of city-states such as ours.
That's an interesting point. So perhaps we have a new kind of medieval system throughout Europe and perhaps the rest of the world, where states grow, flourish on the basis of their expertise, their ability to feed, find minerals, produce ideas, technologies. And perhaps that underpins why a smarter city is an important thing right now as a discussion point. And for us to remain smarter, I suppose we better have some tea, because I've overrun by half an hour. I'm terribly sorry, but we're going to take a break now. Thank you very much.
Hi, yes, so we are running over by quite some time, as you can see. Thank you so much, Sli.do and the panel. And I think maybe what we could do is just take a quick coffee and comfort break, and then come back for 10 minutes. So is that okay? And we'll move on with the next session. Okay, thank you, panel. Thank you, ladies.
Stream's going okay. I'm trying to spread it as much as possible. No water. Like every now and then, like 2 people pop up, one person pops up. It's not like the biggest stream. Yeah. I think it's more to archive it, but still. I don't know. I really need to see if I can get a longer lens. Like I said, where is it from? Basically. The guy, like, yeah, I use a longer lens. Longer lens? Yeah, I can get an 85 and 135. And I have no idea what would happen. Okay.
clergy get paid. But the money that we get is probably are. When you come to the stadium, they have this section and they sit by themselves and they get their best food or school and just sit there and they drink tea and they literally just serve them and they just pull out the food like exactly. They just do their own people, so get a lot more paid in that. So what I'm working with things, he recently got up to some kind of father thing. And working with hospitality, you get paid for £9 plus the tips. Because they're like, the hardest bit is because I get drinks because sometimes stuff depends on what's happening. But some of what's happening, and I'm not wine. I have to get all the wine, instead of let me get all the wine to the same and I have to wheel it and like singing and they
Right, so I'm going to call you back now so we can actually get started. So we can get everyone back in the room, please.
Yeah, more than
say for example, someone is in the room that is so long that they really want to be able to pass their break. And they got to the front of the line rather than
So can we get people to come back in the room, please?
and they were, yeah, they can dash things at you. Yeah, you want to keep on yeah. What do you do? What can I do? What can I do? Yeah, because the thing with your workplace is you always have at least one person that you feel is learned for this to be a customer, but they actually don't for this. So it's like don't know who that person might be because they come to get them to do all this stuff. So they're like, yeah, they know, because that happens right now. So and say, let me try to get you to it, because if you try to get into it, then and then we come back to you and say, hectic, especially because that our little thing is so small. We put hot dogs, pies, and it can also flip at a time. So if that runs out, we have to collect it and wait half an hour. Oh, wait, half an hour.
you got my new
Sure thing. The amount of times I've said I want to try to I'm like, oh my god, I'm going to do this. The amount of times I sat down and started crying. Like, trust me. Trust me. Elderly will look through. And then I'm just there Thursday again. But we do so good at get it.
Right. Is everybody in here? So I think we need to make a start. So, I don't know if the mic is going. We're going to make a start now. See if we're going to make a start here. Yeah. So yeah, I think everybody's in. Okay, so before we hand over to Dave, I just wanted to remind you that obviously we have Sli.do, so lots of questions, and we're going to be picking those up again as we go during the day, and also the open debate later on is really important. And obviously, the records of all the questions will be stored, and so when we communicate back out, we'll come back on what the themes have been discussed and so on during today. The second point I wanted to make is also don't forget to tweet, so hashtag smarter cities now, and then so there's also quite a lot of activity going on Twitter, so hashtag smarter cities now, all one word, if you want to tweet about it as well. So we're going to go back on the programme. So what we're going to do, because we're running quite late, we're going to run through the session. So there's a couple of order changes, or mainly that Stephen Lees is now going to go at the end of the example keynote sustainability projects. So we'll kick off now with the sustainability theme. And I'd like to welcome to the stage Dave Williams from SSAB Swedish Steel, who are also sponsors and outside, so please go and talk to them. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you, and hello everybody. It's a real privilege to be invited to speak at this event today, and it's quite humbling to be in such esteemed company and to listen to the discussions that have preceded my presentation. So, yes, fantastic. Basically, this isn't my normal audience, to be perfectly honest. We as a business, and me personally, I'm quite used to facing industry. We talk to manufacturers, we talk to end users, so this is really something probably out of my comfort zone, but something that as a company we're interested in developing. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, we're a Nordic steel company. We produce, just a few facts and figures, we produce approximately 6 million tonnes of steel product every year. We're based in Finland and in Sweden. And the part of the business that I work for is the colour coating division. And I guess this is where our story really begins. This is our green coat product. SSAB recognised quite a long time ago that we really needed to develop our sustainability as a business. Part of the reason for this is obviously commercial. We recognise as a business that if we're to grow, we need to recognise future building trends. And I think recently we've definitely seen a shift in emphasis of what people are asking us for. I've been involved personally in the steel industry for 20 odd years, and I think this past 18 months to 2 years has been a real shift in what's actually driving people's decisions, and sustainability and kind of the recyclability of the products that we're actually producing is becoming more and more important. Well, this fits very neatly into something that happened. I'll tell you a short story which starts with two Swedes walking into a bar. There's no real punchline to that joke, but I guess there should be really. Some time ago in Sweden there was a government initiative where they were looking at the use of biotechnology, particularly Swedish rapeseed oil, to see whether it could be used in industry. And I think at the time it was kind of struggling to get off the ground. Now, I'm reliably informed that this is actually a true story, but the guy who was responsible for this, and I think he was working for the Royal Institute, happened to be in a bar in the centre of Sweden at the same time as one of our paint technologists, a guy called Professor Per Sli.do. And there was a conversation that took place discussing this use of bio-oils. And after a few Swedish beers, I think Per-Erik had the idea, well, why don't we try to use this technology in paint? So after a few more beers, off they went to the paint lab. I think there was a few experiments that went on. And what we actually discovered is we could actually use bio-oils within a paint system to produce a product that actually performed better than what we've got previously. And the beauty of it being is that you take out petrochemical-based ingredients, you take out solvents from paint, so you take out all the things that are causing harm to the environment and replace it with something natural. And this really is where Green Coat began. It began as a paint system. Before I just go into the technical side of it, I think it's also important to point out that as a company, we also recognise that we have a sustainable product or a sustainable offering, but it's not a box-ticking exercise for us. We also realise that, in effect, steel production, it does have a burden on the environment. You take a raw material out of the ground, so you're using a natural resource. It takes a lot of energy to produce steel, but when steel is actually produced, it's one of the most recyclable products known to man. So if we could lessen the burden at the front end and do as much as possible there, coupled with using natural products and natural ingredients, we were really creating something very interesting. So just quickly, just to say, the blast furnaces and the steel mills that we have in Sweden and Finland, heat from those plants is actually recycled to the local towns. We transport these 6 million tonnes of steel per year on carbon neutral train systems. So every part of the business is being looked at to try and lessen the impact as much as possible. It's not just this kind of, we've got an environmentally sustainable product, we've finished, let's move on. It's a continuing goal. But why use colour-coated steel for buildings? There's a lot of history behind this. This is these particular products, the one that we're really interested in, which is a product that we call PLX, which is it's a kind of a tinsmith, hand-formable material that's painted. So the paint has the flexibility of the steel substrate that it's adhered to. This has been used in Scandinavia since the 1800s. You can see there's a group of Swedish gentlemen sat on a roof, probably having coffee or fika, I would imagine. And there you've got a very traditional kind of Stockholm rooftop scene. But you look out, you know it's a traditional roofing product. The technical bit. People don't realise with steel's seen as a hard, cold kind of structural product that holds buildings together and holds buildings up. We see it differently. We see it as something that actually adds to the building, it adds to the performance of the building, the functionality of it, the aesthetic of it. This product is formable on site, it can be manipulated into different forms and shapes by hand. even down to really low temperatures, so down to minus 15 degrees. Not as I suppose you particularly want to be out fixing steel in those kind of temperatures, but it gives you an idea of how versatile this material is. It's very durable. The paint is very colour stable. It's designed for harsh environments. We have a wide range of colours, so you can, again, if we talk about adding to the aesthetic of the building, there's a good opportunity to choose some really interesting colours. And the product, as I say, it's a traditional product that's been used for a long time in Scandinavia, but we continually test. We don't rely on laboratory testing, we use outdoor testing stations, different parts of the world, so we're continually testing in marine environments, in areas of high pollution, just to ensure that the product lasts and that it's fit for purpose. And these are some examples. And I think, for me, the interesting part of this is, again, it's taking a product which in Scandinavia has been very traditional, and applying it to actually contemporary design as well. So you can see there, you've got a mix, you've got in the centre, you've got the real kind of traditional craftsmanship type building, with some kind of contemporary examples either side. And also how it works with natural material, so with the cedar cladding and the stone cladding, it's quite an organic type product. Just before I move on to that, the green coat story is really important to us. It's a real major step in paint technology. It's patented to Swedish steel. It's the most environmentally friendly pre-painted steel in the world, and it's something that we're really passionate about and excited about. Please, we have a small stand outside. Please come and talk to us and ask us questions. But also, you can taste the rapeseed oil as well. And it is very, very nice. So please come out and talk to us and ask as many questions. We're really excited to share ideas, share projects. Very briefly, don't just limit this to building cladding as well. Many other applications that can be done with this product. So we're really interested if people have got wild, wacky ideas to discuss them with us. And it's now my great pleasure to hand over this microphone to Henning Stummel, the Henning Stummel Architects. And this is a reference case that Henning is going to discuss, which used our product. Thank you very much, Henning. Thank you.
Okay, a quick example of how this material could be used. This is a house I built for myself in West London, and initially I had no idea I was going to use this product. The situation is, the slide doesn't show particularly well, but we bought a plot surrounded on all sides by a building. It's very faint. Is there anything we can do about the contrast? Oh well. So you have to believe me, there's buildings everywhere, and we bought the site. It was a contaminated site with this planning permission to build this ugly bungalow in the middle, and then there would have been a 2-meter perimeter of completely useless space. And our point of departure was to break the brief down into the spaces that we wanted and to group them around the perimeter. You can now see how irregular the perimeter was, and to use this as a device to create a sort of private space in the middle so that all this overlooking would be somehow controlled. And what we realized is that when you put 2 pavilions next to each other and you have well-insulated walls, you can start exploiting those spaces. So the design developed further into this, where we started tucking in little things in between the spaces. So this is a toilet, that's a cupboard, that's a staircase. It's a staircase we were able to go a bit higher on this side. And the finished plan is this. So you come in, the street is, how best to say it? The street is out there, and you come through a gateway building, up a drive, and then you arrive. So you arrive, and you see all these pavilions grouped around a courtyard, and there's a sort of water pool in the middle. That's the living room, dining room, kitchen, an entrance hall. So one of the things that happens is that when you don't have any circulation area, when you don't have any corridors, you just go from room to room to room, which is very efficient, no waste of space. But the downside is that you can't have the rooms in any old sequence, so the bedrooms have to be at the end. And this is actually a little sort of separate mini house which could be sublet. You may have seen this published from above. It looks like this from one of the adjacent roofs. So the shape, the roof shape, it allows maximum of light into our courtyard and into the adjacent gardens. And then we topped off the roofs with these trapezoid roof lights, which are sort of slightly north-facing, so that on a hot day we can open the roof lights and we can get the sort of stack effect going. The warm air sort of escapes and cold air is drawn in from over the pool into the windows. And this is the sort of effect you get within the courtyard. And as we developed this project, we always knew it was to be well insulated. And you know, these days brick is nothing but a veneer. And these pavilions, they sort of started turning into their own little building type around a little piazza. So we wanted the buildings to read as versions of a building type, and because they're so small, we felt it would be wrong for the walls to have a different finish from the roof, and we didn't want any rainwater guttering. We just wanted it to sort of be like gift wrapped, a very sharp geometry, and we found that standing seam metal cladding would achieve all of these things for us. But what we were particularly interested in is we didn't want a zinc which would be grey or a copper which would age differently on different surfaces, and eventually we came across Swedish steel, the green coat product, which really has hit the spot for us, also because this color combination of the sort of greenish, bluish turquoise water and the red, and then on a sunny day you sort of get rippling things going on the wall, so that all works really well, and it also fits quite nicely into the sort of London context. And then the internal spaces, this is what I was describing earlier on. You get sunlight bouncing off walls, coming up and stuff, and you know, rippling rectangles of water ripple somehow here and there, and you can tell what time it is because it moves through the space. So this top-lit space has clearly been influenced by this or by this, James Turrell and the Pantheon. Each room has the sort of lantern. The bedrooms, they have a blackout blind, and that's it already. I think that's a super fast little presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Dave and to Henning, and they are outside. Please don't go and talk to them. So, moving swiftly forward, I'm really delighted to welcome Mikael Fem from Sli.do Group, and who are also sponsors of smarter cities now, and also Tech Nordic Advocates and Tech London Advocates. And Michael is here with a colleague, John Costello, so please go and talk to him. For now, I'd love to welcome Mikael Fem, Head of Global Public Lighting from Sli.do Group.
Thank you. Oops. Oh, look at that. So I'm Michael Fem. I'm representing Sli.do Group. I think it's a lot of UK people here, so I think you recognize Thorn as a brand. It's a UK brand. It's part of our our company. I'm here to talk about the integration of technology, because the technology is out there, and we're also developing solutions with different companies, different partners and cities. And we want to create livable cities and support the citizens, make an easier daily life for them through technology and smart city solutions. But we need to keep in mind that we also need integration, because it could look quite awkward out there. So I have an example from Copenhagen, but first of all I want to show a couple of pictures how it could look like. So the situation in the cities could look differently when we add on technology. So this is not the right one, but we'll have that page. All right. So we jump that one because this is more the one I want to show. This is an example from my traveling, because I'm working globally and I have the honor to work with cities and partners around the world for different solutions, discuss development and so on, which can support their cities and their citizens. And these are some pictures which could be the case in different cities. This is from a park. It's a nice park, it's a nice vintage luminaire, but suddenly it's a grey pole with some strange stuff on. And that is not to create a livable city from my point of view. This is another example. This should be a lamppost or a luminaire pole, but there's no luminaire on it. But there's a lot of other stuff on it, like CCTV cameras, Wi-Fi boxes, and this kind of technical equipment. This is another one. It's actually from Sofia in Bulgaria. This is in front of the city hall. So the mayor take a look at that every morning when he comes to work. And I can't say he's pretty impressed with that. And in the future, if we don't be aware, it could look like this. And I think this is not the way. So what I would like to say with this is that we have a lot of great technologies, we have a lot of great solutions, and if we want to utilize the lighting infrastructure, which makes sense in many solutions, we need to make sure we think about the integration part. And that could be utilized in the luminaire as well as the poles, but this is not to forget that it should be invisible. People doesn't appreciate cameras. So we have been working with different partners for Copenhagen City Solution. For you who doesn't know, Copenhagen City Solution is a smart city department within Copenhagen who's working to identify different challenges in the cities and work together with several different parties, of course, to work out solutions to solve that kind of challenges. And in our case, we have been working with both startup companies as well as service providers and established technology companies, together with Copenhagen, to work out solutions for 2 use cases, which I've been struggling with. And they will test it out now in the street lab of Copenhagen to make sure it's provide the solution they need. So this is one. It's everyone who knows anything about Copenhagen is about green city and sustainability, and they're quite focused on bicyclists and make sure they reach a carbon neutral target, which is a really, really great thing. This luminaire in the middle of the picture, this is actually a special luminaire we developed for Copenhagen City. They went out 2013 in the tender to start a replacement in the city of, first phase was 20,000 luminaires. And they want to have a new aesthetic approach, and they were keen to have some kind of future-proof smart city luminaire. So we work actually together with Copenhagen to develop this luminaire with a Nordic design. And why I say it's more or less a smart city luminaire is because it's two material. It's both high quality polycarbonate as well as aluminium, That means we can integrate RF communication, so we can make it as invisible as possible. That was also the target for the city. So by today we have approximately 11,000 luminaires out there, and now it's time for us to develop and integrate the smart city solutions in them. So this is one which will be used. So when it comes to lighting, lighting has an effect on people every day. And this is something we need to take into consideration. It's about safety, it's about, you know, the daily life of people to feel comfortable. They're coming from an indoor environment out to an outdoor environment. Make sure we take in consideration the lighting as a comfort thing. For this environmental solution, we work together with a startup company. It's called Leapcraft. It's actually growing rapidly now. They have a great solution for air pollution sensing, one of the best in the market. For anyone who knows about the previous way, or in many cases also the existing way to make the monitoring of air pollution, is 20-feet containers, for a cost of 300,000 euro each. It's an enormous bastard. And we need to make it's more accurate, so we need several points in the city to measure it correctly. Unfortunately, I talk about the integration, but this solution for air pollution sensing is not possible to integrate into pole or into a luminaire, because it needs a certain airflow. So, but if you make a nice design of the compartment, it could look like this, almost invisible on the pole. And together with the Leapcraft, we also have another solution, that is noise sensing. This is also something that Copenhagen asked for. They want quite an extended measuring of the noise, and that requires a high quality microphones, and it also needs to make the sound matrix. And this is a hard work for Leapcraft. But this is a solution we will install and in Copenhagen in the Living Lab by after the summer, so in mid-September. The next use case for Copenhagen is of course bicyclists. They are all over the place and they're absolutely ruthless. So maybe we should protect the other, cars and people who's walking, but this is absolutely to make the bicyclist more safe. This is a high focus for Copenhagen, and it's a great thing. So we're working on motion detection, speed categories, because they also have these super bicycle highways, and they're going in high speed, I can tell you. Traffic security and traffic counting. This solution is, of course, to find a way to measure and improve the infrastructure for bicyclists to make this a more livable city. This is a great but also complicated use case. And also here we work with both startups as well as established companies. So in this case we're using cameras from Axis Communication, which is a partner in our ecosystem. So this is it. That was quite fast. Thank you.
That was fast, wasn't it? And that actually, I should probably reinforce that point. So please try and stick to your allocated time because we are so far behind. So that was punctual, sharp, and all the rest. Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. So we're going to make a slight change in the order because Stephen Lee's had to go and make a little conference call. So we're going to welcome onto the stage now Bhakti. Where are we? Yep, you're over there. So super exciting project from the City of London, who are also one of our partners in the whole Smarter Cities Now programme. So over to you, Bhakti. Really looking forward to hearing this one. Thank you.
afternoon or good morning, everyone. I'm Bhakti Dipala and I'm a Senior Planning Officer at the City of London. So a lot of my work is about securing planning permission for the buildings that are going up in the City of London. But more recently we've had a bit of a focus on the Smart Cities, Future Cities agenda. And so we've been trying to think of innovative ways of how we can use smart technologies and data to inform planning, to make it a more informed process and efficient in some ways as well. So I just want you all to imagine that you're walking along the street or you're sort of sitting in a nicely designed open space, but it's windy, it's dark and shady, it's really polluted. It's not actually nice, is it? And so I think we as planners have a real responsibility not to make sure that a place looks nice, but actually it also feels nice. So what my presentation will focus on is the work that City of London have done to date in assessing the microclimate, and we've used baseline assessments and 3D modelling to assess what the baseline microclimatic conditions are and how this 3D modelling can then be used to inform future developments. We embarked on this project sort of more once, obviously everyone knows about the walkie-talkie or 25 Church Street. There were reports that it was quite windy around the base of the building once it was constructed. And it's by no fault of the fact, it's nothing to do with its design, but it's actually just the geography of the city, which is what's made it windier. So then we thought maybe we ought to look into this and find out the reason why. And actually also there's been a case in Leeds where Bridgewater House has been built, and actually there was a fatality because of the wind conditions around the building, and so we want to make sure that that doesn't happen again. So the City of London has more traditionally been seen as this concrete jungle where only business happens on the streets, but actually that's not the case. It's got the best transport routes, and actually the City of London is very inclusive. We're trying to remove these invisible barriers, and there's historic parks and open spaces, very precious streets and alleyways which we need to make sure that we maintain to be of high quality. The way people use public realm today has changed as well. There's a lot more use of outdoor space, alfresco dining, and people actually appreciate being outside rather than within buildings. So today we've had the Lawson's criteria, which measures the wind environment around the city, this is sort of the UK criteria. So Mr. Lawson's criteria was established in the 1970s, and it's now become, you could argue, utilitarian, and it's potentially not fit for purpose, but by no means is a criticism. It's actually something that where we feel like we need to refine this criteria and bring it more up to date. It doesn't take into account things like cycling, because at the moment the number of people that cycle to and from work has risen dramatically. It doesn't take into account elderly and more vulnerable people, or people in wheelchairs, or less mobile. So one of the things that we're trying to do is to see if we can do these baseline assessments to try and refine the criteria and create a more established guidance. So we embarked on a project with a wind consultant, RWDI, and we asked them to construct a 3D model, a physical 3D model at a scale of 1 to 300, and take it through a wind tunnel test. And this is a traditional way of assessing the wind environment and how the wind behaves around tall buildings. So they created, this is the eastern cluster, where the cluster of all the tall buildings are located in the City of London, and they put urban probes around along very detailed urban probes around the base of the buildings, and then they put this model in a wind tunnel test, and we will then be able to identify how the wind behaves around buildings, because the shape of a building, the height of a building, can all influence how windy a place can be. And up until now, we've received wind assessments for individual buildings, but nobody has ever done a holistic review of this, because when you look at an individual building, you can't look at it in isolation. Actually, each building is interdependent on the next, and when you look at it as a whole, we got quite different results, which I'll go into in a minute. What we also did is we collaborated the wind tunnel test with it's a newer technology, which is computational fluid dynamics. And so what we did is, again, a 3D model was created, but this time computationally, and 36 different wind directions were tested to understand the patterns of to understand the wind behaviour around tall buildings. And what we've done is we collaborated these results, and this is just an example of the results we got. And actually doing the collaboration exercise just helps us to reinforce the methodology that we've used to ensure that the results we got are accurate. So just an interesting sort of finding that we found is this is Bishopsgate, and this is sort of the main part of the cluster here. And what we found is actually we've got southwesterly winds, which are the prevailing winds for the UK. And so actually the wall of tall buildings has created a bit more of a windy environment around Bishopsgate. But we're going to use these results now to mitigate that. And a fun exercise that we did is actually London isn't very windy, so by no means think, oh, we live in a windy place, because when we did a comparison, what we did is we lifted the City of London and put it into New York's climate, and actually you see a lot more red spots around New York, which in the New York climate actually shows that London is actually a very pleasant city, but still think that this is an issue that we should address. So this was meant to be a visual that moves the arrows, but I'll go through it anyway. So the arrows, sort of what they would have indicated is the way the wind behaves around the tall buildings. So what actually happens is the wind sweeps around the cluster of tall buildings, and in between the spaces of the tall buildings is actually quite a calm environment. And so that's something that we found quite, the cluster does help the wind environment in that way. And what we're doing with these results is we're trying to use this as a future planning tool, as I mentioned earlier. So what we're doing is we've got this baseline assessment. So anytime there's a new development that's come in, which is at pre-application stage, we can inform the applicants to say, actually, it's quite windy around here, and we can address these issues in the architectural forms of the building rather than doing post-construction mitigation. Because as you can appreciate, the City of London is quite dense, and we're trying to limit the amount of furniture and clutter on the streets. And so the best way to respond to this is being proactive. Try to get involved in the design process with architects and applicants as early on in the process. So an example is, creating more aerodynamic buildings. So obviously we've got an example which is the Gherkin, where the wind sort of sweeps around the curvature of the building. You've got designing podiums into buildings, which I know is probably not in fashion at the moment, but it was once upon a time. And also designing steps into a building, which will then reduce the downdraft and help sweep the wind over. This is just an example of a stepped building and how the wind would react to a stepped building. So it would sort of hit the building at different steps, and it would reduce the downdrafts going down. So it's just so this is an example of sort of post-construction mitigation, where you can add canopies onto buildings. This is at a time when which can come later on in the design process. So right where we've not been able to be as involved early on, there are still mitigation measures that we can take. To extend this piece of work, what we're doing is we're trying to create, where I talked about the Lawson's criteria, trying to refine that, what we're trying to do actually is create a more inclusive criteria. So this, what we are calling the comfort criteria. So this is basically taking into account the impact of wind and air pollution. So again, we're going to conduct a baseline air pollution assessment for the whole of the city. And ideally what we want to do is, once we've got a baseline, use potentially sensors to try and feed that information in to get some real-time data. Then we overlay that with the pedestrian data. So what we've done is done a baseline assessment of how busy our streets are, how many people are going from A to B. This helps us to identify where the pinch points are. And then we can overlay that on top of a noise map, so identify where the noisy areas are. And then we can overlay that on top of a daylight and sunlight map. So these are all the different work areas in the microclimate that we've commissioned to do a baseline assessment. The whole idea is to layer this onto a 3D model and be able to grade the quality of the public realm. So what we have is a 3D model with all of air quality, pedestrian modelling, noise, daylight, sunlight and wind. And then what we can do is essentially have a 3D model, and where we've got a new building coming in, we drop that into the model and say this is going to be the impact on this part of the microclimate. We can then go and tell them and give them feedback and say, well, maybe you ought to locate an open space on the southern side of the building where it's sunnier, where it's not as windy. So you can have more informed planning solutions as opposed to working with things piecemeal. And that's the end of our presentation.
Fantastic, thank you, Marty. I think that's such an interesting project, and I hope you agree. So we are moving swiftly forward to hear about Loop City. Unfortunately, we've had a slight accident with Vibeke, who's stuck somewhere in between Copenhagen and London. Not quite sure where, but she's not here right now. So I'm going to be Vibeke for a bit. And I'm not too unfamiliar with this. I actually sit on the advisory board of Loop City in Copenhagen. So I know a fair chunk about what Vibeke was going to say anyway. And I hope you really enjoyed this story, because I think it's absolutely fantastic. I'm so excited to be part of it, and I'm hoping that a lot of the people on the programme here can become part of it as well. So let me just grab the figure here. So let me talk to you a little bit about Loop City. I hope some of you have heard of Loop City before. But essentially, so this is a map of Zealand and a bit of Sweden, only a small part of Sweden. So which essentially is the greater Copenhagen region. And actually, that's a whole different story altogether, in that a construct has been set up called Greater Copenhagen, which actually encompasses a large part of the Zealand region and also the southern bit of Sweden to become an overall brand that kind of stands for urban innovation on a very large scale. So that's a project in its own right. And Loop City, which I'm going to talk to you about now, is actually part of the whole of the Greater Copenhagen, and includes the bigger southern Sweden. And you can just imagine the kinds of debates that have been come out of that, and the kind of wars between Sweden and Denmark in the past and so on. But that's all in the past. We're all friends now, and part of Greater Copenhagen. So Loop City. Did I go too far? No, I didn't. Loop City is actually an overall urban innovation development smart city program, which I thought it was a slide with the map. But that's basically the map. So if I go over here, I can try and actually point out to you what it is. So kind of this, all this part over there, sort of over to Sweden essentially. So there's 10 municipalities. The Greater Copenhagen region, which corresponds to the GLA, the Danish state, and various other bodies kind of come together to form this whole Loop City program. And Loop City is an overall urban development program, which is all about supporting intelligent urban development, sustainable, dynamic urban business development, with a new railway infrastructure as a backbone infrastructure. So think DLR, so Douglas Light Railway type infrastructure. So a new DLR type structure is being built to bring together, connect the 10 municipalities across Zealand into the southern part of Sweden, which is obviously creating this loop. And the idea is that on the back of the traffic infrastructure, we build a digital infrastructure that connects the 10 municipalities as well, and smart solutions on top of that digital infrastructure. So there's a number of different objectives. So the first two, as I said, urban development and sustainable and dynamic urban business development. So improve livability and really develop an international sort of showcase for how you can bring different councils together and integrate council around an overall urban development programme. Now, those of you who are from councils here will know that's a bit of a tall order to try and get 10 councillors to agree on doing the same thing. And that's not necessarily been easy either. That said, there's a lot of exciting work already happening. So another important objective is to attract investment into the whole of Loop City and obviously people into the region. So it's all about providing, political vision and a strategy, government structure, and holistic approach to this urban development. And I can tell you already now, this is probably not something, as far as we know, that has been done before. So there's a lot of interest internationally in, oh my God, how do you actually do that? Not in one council or one city, but how do you actually create a whole kind of holistic framework for urban development, not only in one country, but also sort of expanding across into Sweden. Oops. Was that Oh, yeah, okay, so that's because we are just about to watch a video. Here we go. So I want to show you the video, just bear with me 1 second, and I hope that will actually bring the whole thing to life a little bit for you. So, yeah, you go.
The capital region is a locomotive for the rest of the country. It's here that growth and jobs are created. Since 1947, the Finger Plan has been the main developmental strategy for the capital region. It's worked very well and been a source of inspiration for urban development internationally. But now, the Finger Plan is challenged. Changing patterns of settlement and business in the suburbs have increased the need to move across the fingers. There's also a movement from an industrial to a digital economy. Loop City is a strategic collaboration between 10 municipalities, the region and the state. This partnership has been created in recognition of the fact that development requires action. And because we can see that growth is lower here than in other regions in Northern Europe. The goal is to ensure growth and quality of life. The means to achieve this lies in innovation, in which we address the challenges together and across administrative borders. Loop City is a movement from 10 suburbs into one connected city. A movement towards intelligent solutions, where we do things together in new, better and smarter ways. A movement supported by a light rail system, which will ensure mobility and new connections. These connections will link Greater Copenhagen in new ways, by making it much easier for a qualified workforce to travel across the city. The Loop City area has a huge development potential. We have the space and framework to create solutions that support sustainable growth and increased quality of life. Loop City is a necessary, targeted leap into the future. A leap accelerated by technological solutions that will make Loop City Northern Europe's centre for intelligent urban development.
So I hope that gives you an idea. It's a really, really quick overview, and I'm here on behalf of Loop City. As I said, I sit on the advisory board of it, and also on behalf of Vibeke Linnestampe, who actually runs Loop City, to really invite you all to engage with Loop City. So there's so much work going on over there. We're working in one of the 10 councils right now, municipalities, on transport and mobility solutions that are being developed right now, and there will be plans coming out for smart city solutions and data solutions that need to be developed, tested in one of the 10 municipalities and rolled out across the whole of Loop City. So there's huge potential to engage with the programme, and we're going to be communicating to you as part of Smarter Cities now what some of those opportunities are, and of course be open to hear about other things too that are not necessarily being thought of already. And Loop City is also a partner and a sponsor of Smarter Cities now, and I'm super excited to be part of it, and obviously will play a key role in our follow-up in October as well in Copenhagen. So that was Loop City, much more to follow on that, and so with that, I'd like to hand over to Stephen Lees from City Logic, MD of City Logic, who will talk to us about a super exciting new Innovate UK first of a kind project that we are also hoping to possibly take to Copenhagen. So over to you, Steve.
Good morning, everybody. I suspect I'm the one who's standing between you and lunch. Is that right? Maybe. Okay. One of the things I love about Jeanette is she sort of brings together a group of people who I think are going to have a lot of commonality, and you bring a great vision of a project as well. But when she invites me, I suspect she also brings a bit of controversy to the conversation, so I'd like to be a little controversial and maybe just contradict some of the ideas that make us feel very comfortable. Smart cities is lovely. It's a lovely phrase. It implies positiveness. I think our cities are actually doing a very good job of trying to kill us, actually. If you live in London, the pollution is probably going to make you live a lot less long. The transport's going to mean that you don't get to that urgent appointment, maybe at a hospital, that when you do get to the hospital, there are too many people there, and ultimately your children are also going to be educated right next to the road and have a shorter life because of it. So I don't think we have the luxury, unfortunately, of a nice, benign, leisurely view of the world that's going to take place. So I think it's going to be quite hard. And the reason I say this is because I moved to Yorkshire recently, and I live near Bradford. And Bradford at the time was one of the most innovative, forward-thinking cities in the Industrial Revolution. There were a few slight challenges though. You may have been able to make cotton and clothing, but the average age was 26, life expectancy. You could set fire to canals and they would actually take lives because of the pollution. Now, you may think that's extreme, but actually I would argue that where we are today with the pollution in London is as similar, because it's going to kill as many people as it did in Bradford, probably, I suspect. So I don't think we can congratulate ourselves. So as an SME, we are taking a more radical approach to some of the ideas and introducing some disruption. I'd just like to give you a view on that. Not because it's about us, but it's hopefully going to add a lot of value to what we're going to do over the next couple of days. Okay, so behind me you see a little bit about City Logic, and we're lucky enough to have a global framework deal with Vodafone. So as a small company, 2 years old, we're lucky enough to have that sort of support behind us. We're focusing on something fundamentally different, and it's the use of the mobile phone, but in a very different way to the way we use it. I'll just explain that in a second. It's the fact that we carry them around with us all the time, and we're just going to explain how that is providing a data set that we need. My final, I suppose, controversial point is I think smart cities are nice in concept, but we often don't find the information and the flow good enough to actually make informed decisions. So if this room was a smart city, I think when we walk in we expect to be able to turn on the lights, be able to turn on the monitors. The fact is, I know the cities don't have the information they need. One of my team was in yesterday with the city, and they said, we've got all this technology, but we do not know what's going on. And I'm thinking, this is 4 years into your program, and you still haven't got the base data, and it's going to be very expensive to collect in the main. So this offers a different approach. Okay, enough said. Using the mobile phone then, and we've been doing this for 2 years. We've done about 25 projects so far, and we've managed to pay our own way in terms of building the SME hub. We're based in the Urban Innovation Centre, Future City Catapult, and delighted to be working on a day-to-day basis. Okay, could I have the next slide up, please? That's possible. Okay, so mobile phones. If you read that, that's the Ofcom report on mobile phones. I suspect most people have a smartphone in here, but that may be your world. It's not my daughter's world. She spends about 6 hours on that phone every day. So what is the mobile phone world? Well, it's sort of like this, right? It's sort of, I never thought I'd be carrying a lithium battery around with me, and but the one thing is, I am actually using this phone. And what we've done is we've taken the phone signal, nothing to do with the phone, just the phone signal, the token that is on the network, and we use that to passively monitor your movement from where you start your day to where you finish your day. your home cell to your workplace, your dwell times, your mode of transport, and we can do that for 1/3 of the population. In fact, everybody in this room who's on Vodafone, we will have that information today, because we're literally doing this now every day of the week, and we're doing it to the millisecond of the network with the support of Vodafone. So, moving on. Thank you. It's the balancing of trying to carry all these different things in my hand. So if we buy into that world and we accept that we're all carrying them, and that we're going to be carrying them for the long term, what have we done? Well, we took this idea to innovate just before Christmas. We wrote the business case. I'm pleased to say, you're the first people to know, that we were awarded £1 million a week ago by Innovate, and we started a project yesterday. First of a kind is an unusual project, and I hope it's useful to this audience in that we have 12 months to take the concept, build the technology, although a lot of it's already been built, fully operationalise it, deploy it in 2 places in the UK, both of around 500,000 people, learn all the lessons, finish the build, and then go to market. And that's what we've been given the money for by the government. 100% funding, and we shared a pot of £20 million with some other companies who will be announced in this week or so. Who are our partners? This is not a closed team, by the way. This is a team that's going to prove the point. So we've got KPMG, who are going to validate the benefits. We've got Kinetic, the government research laboratories, who are going to basically test it for us. And the Future Cities Catapult are going to kindly demonstrate it in the living laboratory. But by February, in fact, quite a lot earlier than that actually, we will have 2 live full demonstrators of the movement of people by vehicle, by foot and public transport, fully comprehensive. And why are we confident doing that? Well, we've just done the 2 leading international airports in this country. In one case, 45,000 cells, 10 million journeys a day, and that model is going to be used for the future of the airport. We've done something around 15 local transport studies and 3 cities. But this capability's got much more to go. But this is where it starts, and it's 3 and 4G, but it will turn into 5 ultimately. Okay. One of the things that we've chosen to do is to be very compliant with privacy. So we are fully privacy compliant. This allows this to be used in a city without the concerns of the citizens. In fact, we've gone absolutely out of our way with privacy groups to get this landed. We're just about to commence the largest virtual public inquiry in the UK with no physical counting taking place. So Vodafone kindly enough providing the data, we're brokering effectively the data, and then the city's going to be using it. And this is effectively, I would argue, a key enabler, hopefully you'll agree, for the projects that we would wish to do. A slide I just took from the Future Cities Catapult response to advanced urbanisation, which the government's asked. You'll see a smorgasbord behind me of all the things that we aspire to do as a community. But the one thing that's really apparent is there's a line running through this, which is the digital technology to actually make it happen. The 3, 4, 5G network is owned by us all. It exists. There's no requirement to reinvent it. This is literally there. We can turn this on straight away at any moment, any time, and capture that information. That data is inherently available to the city. And listening to around the pollution, etc., this is the movement of London at what is called a lower super output area census level. So it's very, very accurate, although actually it's related to the masts where they are, not to the grid system that we use on mapping. I think one of the important things in all of this as an SME is understanding where you are, and then the question came earlier about how do you make money. Well, we've chosen a place in the value chain, so if you look at this, there's the requirements and the complexity. A lot of you folks could use this information way better than we have ever would be able to do, so we very much see ourselves in the middle tier providing this information to the city, and that's exactly where we've been going. So hopefully this adds value to the collaboration we're talking about in the coming day or so. Okay. I've talked a lot about what we're doing as opposed to showing you what we've done, so I just thought I'd just take 3 pictures. The visualization is just a representation of the data. That can be done in many different ways. But this first one was actually done in 2012, and it's the Marylebone Road. And that road is very interesting. If you really go back to the architectural view, if you want to understand a building, you need to know everything around it. If you want to understand a road, it's exactly the same. If this was a river The Marylebone Road is the river, the tributaries are everything that inform change. And every road in London, or any city, actually has that same set of characteristics. It costs a lot of money to try and work this out using traditional techniques. So that's effectively one view of the city, using this sort of data. One could take a pedestrian view of it. That's everybody who was on that same road and where they went to and came from. It's classically called origin destination. We can do this for any road in the city. We can do it for any large-scale building. But it's the point of using our own movements as a community to understand that road, not to put in very expensive infrastructure to actually achieve the same aim, because we're already contributing to that through our funds. Probably the most interesting of all the three diagrams I just wanted to show you here was a diagram which was everybody who passed an object in central London and where they finished their day. So that's effectively that. And it effectively gives you a view of use of an asset. If you flicked it round, you could do tourism the same way. But actually, the area we've just completed, literally a few days ago, was we did Liverpool city centre. And we looked at everybody moving into the city by vehicle to car parks, and then how they move from car parks into the centre. And what's very evident is that the car parks are too close to the city centre. They're causing the congestion, actually. And that's one of the issues. What we've done so far with our cities is good, but we're now finding some of the shortcomings in it. And so I think this information is really critical, I would argue, to the sort of project that Jeanette envisages. So, I'll let you judge whether this capability is useful. We think it's disruptive because it turns on the world on its head, and it looks at the world in a very different way. And I'll go back to talking about, if you look at Bradford, when it was in the Industrial Revolution, they lit the city originally with gas, but actually, so the light was gas, but it turned into electricity. Electricity became the predominant lighting, and gas became a heating system. I don't think that was what was expected. And this is why change is so difficult to judge. A lot of the technology that we may think is relevant may quickly disappear, and they may be carrying more lithium batteries around than I ever envisaged. Unless Apple really get themselves into a good order. So that's our view of the world. I'm delighted to be part of this, and I hope the next few hours are going to be creative, but also realistic in terms of where we need to go next.
Thank you, Stephen. I think this is so exciting, right? I mean, this is just super exciting stuff, and I think the more you do of it, and with that new project as well, it's just there's so much scope, and we can take that into the programme as well. So thank you to Stephen. So we're going to try and catch up with the programme a little bit. So if it's okay with you, we are all going to go for the next 4 speakers and then break for lunch at that point, and then we'll kick off the solution challenge and the City of London hackathon after lunch. If that's okay with you, I reckon you probably will be quite hungry soon. So, after Stephen, another super exciting project, really pleased that Jamie is here with us today. So, I think the pictures, and Jamie will speak for himself, so I won't say anything more. Over to you, Jamie.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you're feeling well right now. Next to my name in the programme is the word culture. I'm just wondering if anyone here has a favourite definition of culture that they would love to share. Yeah, what people do. I find it a bit tricky. I think it's a bit like describing love. We know it exists, but we can't measure it or weigh it. And every time we think we define it, it sort of loses its meaning, and we want to come up with something else. As a kid, I lived in a desert city that was rapidly expanding. It was called Jeddah. And there was money pouring out of the ground. There was a lot of building going on, and a lot of money put into making parks and expensive planted areas and loads of light. And no one would go and meet at these places. They were empty. And then I remember I was about 5 years old, and it rained super hard. Like it rained like it never rained for 3 days, biblical rain. And all of these holes in the desert around the city filled up with water. And we all went running out to these holes outside the city and played in the water. all of us from different religions, different races, different cultures, we just played for the 2 days that the water stayed there. And it was the most uplifting, fun, connecting experience that I can remember. So it's probably no surprise that since then I have tried to fill Trafalgar Square with balls to make the world's largest ball pit, so we can all float, holding hands, watching the stars. Hasn't happened yet, but if anyone here can help. I've also set up a company to link London up through zip lines, so we can experience the city through different perspectives. That hasn't happened yet, so that's my last pitch. And I'm building an action water sport park in a dock over the land, if I get permission. So that's my last pitch. But I'm actually here to talk about a friend's project. Martin is a Dutch guy. When he was 18, he was backpacking in Guatemala and in a little place called Antigua, and he saw a girl walk past, about 5 years old, and she had no shoes on. So he stopped her and took her into a little store and bought her a pair of shoes, like Converse, with little flames on the side. And in that evening, he was at his B&B, his bread and breakfast, and this woman came in with the little girl, and they didn't speak the same language, so she was like, going, "Thank you for buying my daughter's shoes, will you come up to my shack for some dinner?" So he followed her up the hill, and it's surrounded by volcanoes, and he was following her, getting darker and darker, thicker vegetation, higher and higher. He's thinking, shit, I'm going to get up there and the dad's going to be there with a machete and that's it, take my shoes and end of story. But he gets up there, there's 4 kids in the shack, and 1 bed and a roof with holes in it. And he was like, there's hardly any point having shoes if you haven't got a roof over your head. So he spent the next month living with them and used his student loan to rebuild their shack. And during that time he learned about the typical life plan of people at that level of society in Antigua and Guatemala, which is a super poor place. And he went back to Holland and raised enough money to set up a school. It's an amazing school, which is now an NGO, and he set up 2. In the last 10 years, he set up 2 of these schools. But he's got pissed off and bored with going back to people and asking to borrow money and raise money and get money. So he came up with the idea of, to make it sustainable, he bought an old building in Antigua and he's turned it into a boutique hotel. And the idea is that the boutique hotel funds the school and gives work opportunities to the parents of that school and trains, illiterate elders into working in hospitality and stuff like that, but that doesn't earn enough money either. So he went to the Dutch Ministry of Defence and he bought 2 old floating detention centres that were used for refugees off them and turned the first one already into a super cool hotel. And it floated outside Amsterdam Central Station. It's called The Good Hotel, 140 bedrooms, and it trains 50% of all the staff who come on board are trained locally, having been out of work for 2 years. And all of the money from the people who stay in the hotel goes back to the schools in Guatemala. It only had permission to float outside Amsterdam Central Station for a year, and then they were going to go to Rio for the Olympics and the football, and that was all planned. They had a mooring spot, but then the finances and the political situation took a downturn. They had to find someone else. So about 9 months ago, he phoned up and he goes, "Oh, I'm in a rib in the Thames looking for a place for my big boat, yeah?" And I'm like, "Dude, forget it, London, you kidding? You'll never find anywhere." 2 months later, there's a photo of the hotel being pulled across from Amsterdam to Victoria Docks. If you get on the Emirates bubble ski lift and go from here, as you're going over, you'll see it. It's parked in the Victoria Dock there. I think there are 2 other photos of the hotel arriving. The last one, yeah, there you see it. That's what you'll see if you come. And so the Good Hotel is now. So for less than £500,000, this 140-room hotel is now in London, and it has brought on board its first recruits from Newham Council who are being trained up in hospitality. So again, 50% or so. The whole program is run. Now, what I love about this story is that most big businesses are still operating with 20th century mindset, and for a hell of a lot of the last 100 years, businesses have been developing, and cities, and we've all been thinking in the same way. We're going to be driven towards profit and success, and then once we're doing quite well, we will try and find something good that we can do to give back to the community, or, oh shit, we built all the houses, now how do we create a sense of culture? What are we going to do? Bring in artists and stuff like that. This is completely the opposite. This started with what can we do that's good for people, and then how can we build what's needed to sustain it around it. And I just think that sets quite a good example, and I think business is shifting in that way. The social consciousness of all of us and businesses that are doing well and successful are literally driven by giving back rather than taking.
I think that is just so inspiring. So I actually went to the opening just over the road, and I think some of you might have seen that we said if you need a place to stay for today and tomorrow, go and stay. It is so cool, you will not believe it. I mean, it's the pictures, however good, just don't do justice. And there is some more exciting news about the Good Hotel after lunch and the way in which they're part of this programme. So I will keep you in suspense until then. So we have our next speaker now, just making sure I get that right. So we've got, and you're already here, fantastic, Kevin Brennan from Brickworth. So over to you, Kevin, thank you.
Okay, I'm Kevin from Brickworth. The guidance for this forum was no speeches actually, which is sort of good. So it's a series of quick bullet points really through the lens of our own work, the interior, and the focus of it is really about the lowest probably common denominator in interior design is shopping. I hear you boo. But we deal with the spaces left over. Professor Coates mentioned those sort of precious spaces are left. And we deal with the spaces left over from whatever city it is, and really, what we're left to the estate agents and the sort of B1, B2 available. And dealing with sort of the city as is smart or not smart. So we work across the globe. We work in an office in London and New York. We work with all various brands. Retail, like I said, is sort of one of our biggest streams of work. And we deal with a lot of the bigger multi-brands, and I think it's fascinating how they are sort of challenging us, and if they are actually informed by technologies themselves, about capitalization and all those sort of things that excite me. Like my 15-year-old son knows more about technology than I do, and I think the way these brands are taking on technologies and adopting bloggers and Instagrammers at a very young age is a sort of an interesting debate. No time to go into that now. The brand experience, brands are now sort of all coming together. Sort of the way that developments are promoting themselves as sort of eco-friendly and sort of hospitable, healthy. You can see that in sports brands where our main concerns are is that they're crossing over into fashion and vice versa, all being informed by the promotion of sustainability. So it's an interesting word. But I think for us, sustainability is that once these developments are done, how sustainable is it? How is the community built around it? A lot of developers are talking to us about pop-up scenarios, and they're trying to build a culture prior to the development commencing, which is a sort of an interesting idea. Or they're sort of spearheading moves into sort of existing cultural phenomenon, like like the small Shoreditch or sort of Hackney places like that, and various places around Britain, sort of Birmingham, sort of jewellery quarter and things like that. So you do have developers like Cathedral and people like that who are trying to sort of force a culture on a place prior to the development commencing. And for us, it's interesting that the development of these sort of pop-up parks and things like that, which we were part of with Box Park, sort of became a sort of a crude vehicle for cheap developers in a way and cheap retailers to take on pop-up phenomenon. This is a Puma project that pops up and pops down very, very quickly and in various places, but this sort of pop-up became almost quintessentially, can you build me a cheap interior? Which is sort of interesting in its own right. With a sort of a structure like this, we can take it up and take it down, and it's interesting how these sort of very basic technologies and a palette you can finally juice to sort of inform current interior design aesthetics. A66 is a sort of a strategy we worked on with Nike. There's a fantastic book called Who's Afraid of Nike Town, I don't know if anyone's read it, by Frederick von Barries. And I'll just read something from it. It says, Nike's urbanism encompasses the temporary occupation of urban spaces and signals Nike's protest against the functionalised city of modernity, and in addition, it constitutes an alternative plan for today's cities. According to the grand strategic objective, Nighttown is a new kind of city, free, daring and eventful. So Nike's urban strategies, this is one, which was to counterbalance the sort of the Adidas taking over the City of London during the Olympics. So Nike's adoption was to take on non-Olympic sports. In this case, it was a skate park, which we designed under the Westway. Again, trying to find sort of these urban patches that have not been conquered by overdevelopment or developers. And here's just a series of very cheap containers being tied up and sort of gave. And you know, in fairness to Nike, they didn't overbrand it. There's just some sort of small swoosh on the window, but they literally did give this back to the community. They're by no means my favourite brand, but in this instance, they left and gave this back to the community. And it's a very successful skate park with schools and learning going on in there. Again, that's the sort of main skate park. Again, Nike during, again, part of their Nighttown being everywhere, not just the shopping on the Oxford Circus. During the campaign, they took over Bermondsey, and we sort of built for them a tennis court scenario, very cheap, just to promote a sort of a new brand where we had Serena and this chap came down and sort of launch it for them. So they're very canny, these people, and they're working hard to sort of subliminally sort of take over the world. But what's interesting is that tribalisation, we think, of these brands and how these types of people are taking over the cities, regardless of how we try to engineer them. Supreme is a brand we've been working for a long time, and Nike, Adidas, if you sort of took from the success of Supreme on a sort of a pounds per square person, whatever it is, that denominator, they would walk all over them. And they created this sort of this sub-brand, this street brand, which is a phenomenal success with drops every Thursday, the queues around the block. It's a sort of success that the bigger brands can only dream of. And with brands like this, you can just take on sort of back street places. This is one in sort of Soho.
What was every Thursday?
It's a drop. It's called a drop. It's when the new stuff hits. And so you see here, there's like the new range of trousers or t-shirts, and they literally queue around the block. What happens here? There's another. What's phenomenal about this? There's another. They limit the shops, and what happens? Most of these kids who buy this stuff then drop it onto eBay, and it sells itself, and off it goes. It's phenomenal, and it's. So this is the one in Soho. We've done one in Paris. There's one in Berlin coming. A phenomenal success, but it's interesting because the shop interior is like pared back. It's just very accurate. It's very minimal in a sense. We work with Mark Gonzalez, who's an artist and a skateboarder. There's not much for us to show off about. This is a green shop over in the Murray. Again, the drop here is quite controversial because there's blocks and blocks of security because kids are being robbed as they're walking away with the goods they're so valuable on eBay. Again, it's very, very subtle interior. It's just a very, really relying on Mark Gonzalez to sort of decorate it as he feels fit. Just running through. What's interesting now is like we're working into, this is a new end store for us. It was opened in Glasgow a couple of weeks ago. Everyone's saying that we're deaf to retail, but now this is a brand, a multi-brand, teenage, young 20s, 30s top that emerged from internet shopping. And now those internet shoppers want us to show them to go and check out before they buy. So it's gone totally against the idea that internet shopping has become the end, literally, hence the name. It's the start. And so you get these new, very high-end, very luxurious embroidery for kids, which is phenomenal, I think. This is more at home chemistry. There's t-shirts and trainers. And then just lastly, just finish on Box Park. This is the one that we worked on Box Park models for a long time, and this is going back to what Dr. Richard Patterson was on about earlier, about the Piazza, the town square. So those spaces in between, I just wondered if Nike was right, because this represents a new kind of city of free, daring, eventful, where you get these sort of public spaces that are free to enter. And so from the digital age, we're getting more back to an analog idea, more collective, getting together again, because of the technologies that allow us to communicate and gather. This idea of Box Park is just a sort of interesting. I think it's just a start with where these sort of makeshift cheap containers, cheap environments are allowing brands to start up in a more cost-effective way, rather than being these big city developments which just have this sort of retail available, crosshatch wooden planks outside for years and then wait for someone to turn up. And that's the end, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So many different angles on this. I think it's just so exciting. Moving forward swiftly, we're delighted also to have the support of Future Cities Catapult for the Smarter City Sound programme. So Stephen already talked about the involvement in that. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome John Patrick onto the stage and hear what you've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. So I've got an opportunity to come and talk to you a little bit around sort of how we interact with cities, more around the sort of experience. But the interesting thing that occurred to me, both in all the talks we've actually had this morning, is this concept around time and actually understanding how that affects our relationship with the buildings we work in and buildings we live in, but also the technology and how the rates are moving at a phenomenal speed, and how that actually affects the interaction we have, the experience we have with the space around us. And it's really interesting in some of this conversation this morning around spaces and architecture and understanding how technology can feed into that. So I work for the Future Cities Catapult. I'm the head of Connected Cities, as you see there. The Future Cities Catapult is an innovation centre of excellence. It is centred here in London, and a big key element for us is really, this is our mission statement, is for us to actually drive innovation, to actually grow UK companies and to make cities better. A bit of a bold claim, and definitely a wide-ranging element of things we actually have to do, but that does give us fantastic scope to look at the different ways we can actually improve cities and really think about how innovation can make that change and difference. The great thing about being in this building, and actually when I found out about the fact that we were in this building today, is it allowed me to actually think about an experience that happened to me actually here about 7 years ago. Before coming to the Catapult, I actually worked for a big property developer, an international one, and actually the developer that built this building. Now, I joined at the time when we'd actually just finished this building, and I had the opportunity to walk around this building as it was opened, and the professor very kindly let us tag on the end of an open day for prospective students. The really interesting thing for me was actually we got to see this building in operation, which is pretty rare for a developer. Normally you build a building and then move quickly on. We actually get to see people experience the space. And the really interesting thing that actually happened on that day was we were tagging along at the back, we were walking along, we weren't actually getting involved because it was more about the students and their engagement. And one of the things that was coming up from the students is the standard questions you'd expect them to ask. Where's the cafe? What's going on about the library? Where can I do this and what's that for? Well, halfway around, a student put her hand out, and a prospective student put her hand out, and she said, excuse me, to the professor, could you actually tell me what the BREEAM rating of the building is? And I was kind of staggered by that at the back. For those who don't know, BREEAM is a sustainability assessment methodology for rating the sustainable credentials of a building, really. And it blew me away to the point of actually having to ask her the question afterwards. Why did you ask that question? And she said, oh, that's easy. I'm going to be here for a long period of time, and I'm going to be in a lot of debt when I leave, and I want to know that the money I'm spending is actually being utilised properly. And that kind of really resonated with me at the time, and still resonates with me now. Don't get me wrong, I know not all 17-year-olds are interested in BREEAM and building physics, but the reality is the shift has changed in that time frame. We'd actually gone from, in my age, when I was 17, talking about sustainability, it was all about the state of the environment in relation to the Amazon rainforest, and unfortunately it still is, we haven't solved that problem. But now we've moved on to actually recognise that a youth culture coming through is actually on top of things like responsible investment and social behaviour change. And that is quite an interesting aspect for me in terms of how we experience those buildings and we experience those things. More importantly, it's about time. It's not just about geolocation or where you are, it's actually about generational shift. So that time question brings into question actually how do we see the buildings around us shift? How do we actually see those places change? And I just thought I'd put one example up. For me, I don't know if you've actually ever seen this, but this is quite a powerful image for me. This is Shanghai in 1987. This is actually part of the Pudong region and rapidly will become the financial centre. This is Shanghai in 2013. And for those that will miss that or blinked at that point, there we go, 1987, 2013. In 26 years we've had that shift. Those that are actually really paying attention will notice the only thing that's actually stayed the same in all that time is that clock tower. Everything else has changed around it. And that goes back to the point that was made right at the beginning of the day, you know, are we living in a building site? The reality is development actually goes on all around us constantly, and that will affect the experience we have for space. That will affect actually how we feel about these places. But it's not just actually about these buildings. I mean, that's happened in 26 years. And you can say to yourself, yes, well, okay, that's the Far East, that's going at a phenomenal rate. But the reality is, how many of these buildings in London Skyline were here 26 years ago? What does the next 26 years look like? It's a really interesting question around how we actually experience those spaces. It's not just around urban form, it's not just around the actual places we see around us. We also have the big question around technology. This is an example of 2005. The Pope was about to give a speech at the time. For those eagle-eyed amongst you, you can recognise some interesting technology we once used to refer to as a camcorder, which very few people actually see these days. Wind the clock forward to just merely 2014, so a couple of years ago. It's a very different perception of how actually we experience that event. I know it's a rather dramatic picture, but I thought I'd throw that in anyway. But it does give you a sense of the scale and the rapidity of actually how technology is becoming pervasive in our society, and actually how we interact and experience events that go on around us. And I have thrown this one in because you could actually say this as a sort of flippant conversation around being so glued to a screen you miss the great things around you. But to my point, this is just shifting the culture in terms of the way we experience, the way we actually understand, the way we connect. We actually recognise that, from my perspective, this is relatively okay, actually. This is just a different form of communication and a recognition we're moving in the right direction. And we actually have to recognise that this forms part of our daily lives. The concept of there being an app to solve a solution is true. This is one that actually prevents people from walking into things when they're sending texts, which I wish this morning actually occurred to the young lady who walked into me actually on the escalator as I came up the stairs of the tube. However, I did feel like pointing out that these things exist. But the point is, this is kind of a sort of low-level entry in terms of sort of augmented reality that is becoming pervasive in our society. People are actually engaging through a screen into a real world, and actually we have to recognise this is real and this is happening. This is actually goes beyond that. We actually move into new breakout areas that affect the different ways we do different models. This is, if you actually are staying in a Starwood hotel, you have the option to walk in through the front door, never see anybody, find out which room you're staying in, walk up to the front door of your room and let yourself in. You can even check out from your mobile phone. Now, not everybody wants to do that, but some people will, and we have to recognise that there are different shifting elements of experience across society, and this may well grow as we continue. We're seeing more and more of this actually coming into how we experience our own homes. Heating and lighting is the obvious first point, but with things like the Amazon Echo and several other technologies landing in our own homes, the way we interact with technology is rapidly growing. The true Internet of Things is a phenomenal concept, but the point I really want to make in terms of time frames is very, very short. We were talking earlier on around 26 years of growth when you took at physical forms like the urban environment. Internet of Things is growing at a phenomenal rate. Right now there's about 5 billion devices connected to the internet in terms of forming that Internet of Things around the globe. By 2020 that's looking to be around 25 billion. It's going to be a staggering growth in 3 years. And that will truly affect the way we experience spaces going forward. I genuinely believe we will be in a scenario in not too distant a future where actually information will be fed to you in multiple different streams in multiple different ways through various different technologies. And it's not, it can easily be taken to a degree in terms of a sort of big brother type of philosophy where commercialism will be forcing information to you via your phone. But the truth is, I think it'll almost be the reverse. I think the youth culture will see, I already talked about earlier on, particularly around retail, and that's a fantastic example of how things permeate their way through, will actually happen. These cities and these open spaces can actually engage more with you as an individual, not just you engaging with them. So it'll be an interesting new space we'll be moving into. The Internet of Things is a dramatic new space, but the thing is, because it's moving quite so quickly, we are struggling with concepts that actually are affecting those experiences, things that actually happen globally. Different elements from different cities are causing the growth at such a rate that we are in a scenario where we're tripping over ourselves. We're actually creating our own barriers because people are using different standards, different technologies, different routes. So we are actually involved in a project at the Catapult right now, Synchronicity, which is a fantastic scheme. It's recognising this rapid growth of the Internet of Things and how can we break down some of those barriers? How can we work with a number of partners on big scale opportunities, including some cities there, including things like Helsinki, Manchester, Milan and so on. How can we create a testbed that actually allows us to create a digital marketplace for SMEs, for organisations and groups, to actually be able to talk at the same level, to actually engaging on the same platforms, to ensure that actually when the Internet of Things lands in a couple of years, we're not creating siloed effects of that technology. And how do we create a scenario where you can actually create scalable opportunities from one company to the next, and actually get it from one country to another, and not fall foul of hitting some of those barriers and the sense of experience based on one city over another. So that's just a very quick overview in terms of some of those time-led philosophies that I think actually do affect the way we experience spaces. And it'll be really interesting, I'm sure we'll have more debates later on in terms of what actually can change going forward to allow for that. But I just wanted to end by saying thank you very much for your time, and I'll be around if you've got any more questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. And those words, that's exactly what this is about. It's all about breaking down borders between countries and cities and providing scalable opportunities and working together and so on. So that is exactly it. And we have full of plans of how we can take some of that into the programme and do it in Copenhagen, the other Nordic countries as well, and get more partners in and actually, and I'll talk about that a bit more tomorrow, how we can blend, mix up startups and SMEs developing on these kinds of things. So absolutely right on the ball. We have one more speaker before we break for lunch, and I'm extremely honoured to welcome all the way from China. Let me try to pronounce your name properly. Chui Manmo. And very warm welcome to you, and so delighted to be bringing a whole different, not Nordic or UK, international perspective to the forum. So very warm welcome to you.
Thank you. A slight correction, I'm from Singapore. And I do have a London office, and Maria and I are pleased to be here today with something to share with you. I'd like to transport you to a really different place, a different context, and talk about cities which want to be smart but are not that smart. Just wanted to share with you a project that we are currently doing in a city called Gurgaon, which is a suburb of New Delhi. Gurgaon is a city that is rapidly developing. It's been developing furiously for the last 15 to 20 years. It's a suburb of New Delhi, to the south of New Delhi. You can see in the distance the city that we envision will be built in the next 10 years. This project is going to take 7 years to build. Okay, you can see the project on the right-hand side. It's called Arohan. It's a residential development, just about 32 stories high, and it's actually springing out of the ground as we speak. City of Gurgaon is a city that was just about 20 years ago nothing but farmland. And just to give you some perspective, you can see here the city of Gurgaon growing and rapidly urbanizing. You can see the little blue bit, that's Gurgaon, and the red bit, which is New Delhi. And you can see just how fast and furious the growth has been. A city that just about 100,000 is now 3 million. And from this, you can really see the clash of cultures, urban cultures versus traditional vernacular culture. The suburb is rapidly urbanizing, and we're transforming our rural land from village culture into city culture. And there's a huge clash of not only civilizations but technologies as well, and traditional lifestyles and contemporary lifestyles. You're looking at people going from a very low level of living into a very high density environment. Much of the work we're doing at WOW now in our Indian projects, and indeed even in our China projects, is talking about this change. How we are taking a traditional horizontal living format into a vertical format. And a lot of our exploration has to do with various cultural, social, and technological aspects of this change. Taking a horizontal village into a vertical village. Just wanted to give you some idea of the challenges that we are having in India and many parts of the developing world. On the left-hand side, you can see in Gurgaon, a traditional village that is existing for hundreds of years. The FAR, the floor area ratio, is 0.5. The red bit shows our site, which the government in all its wisdom has given an FAR of 3.5. Why? Because they're actually building a mass rapid transport system on the road. And so to justify the cost of the mass rapid transit, they have allowed developers to really increase the development potential to justify the urban intensity. So in between, you can see this little green patch, which they have designated as a biodiversity park. And here comes the situation. Private sector has accumulated land in whichever fashion they can. So you can see here that this developer, the bit in red, which is our project, he has really come up with a very funny, odd-shaped piece of real estate, and has asked us to actually come up with a solution to create high-end residential living. So you can see that from on the left-hand side, a very traditional village, low density, almost medieval-like city form, and on the right-hand side, what modern urbanization and modern development and policy has resulted in, which is fragmentation, isolated bits of the city, not well coordinated, all focused around justifying urban infrastructure. So, what's our concept? We were asked to navigate a really seemingly impossible set of contradictions. On one side, a very well-established village, and on the right-hand side, a new city that's emerging. So we defined several rings of growth, rings of influence. You can see here that we have community, the urban, we have this green biodiversity park, all of them intersecting somehow in our site, which is sort of bridging between the traditional cityscape and the future cityscape. So, just to give you some more three-dimensional visibility, you can see on the left-hand side, those Okay, thank you for that. And the building is essentially on both. Hello, can you hear? Okay. So the city of Gurgaon. Okay. Stand here. So the city. Can you hear me? So the city of Gurgaon is fraught with these contradictions. You can see here on the misty winter's day, the traditional cityscape and the new cityscape springing around it. We have the biodiversity part, which is really green and beautiful. And you can see the site, which is really springing up in this wilderness between the traditional and the new cityscape. Our concept really is to bridge these contradictions. India is a country that has very proud cultural heritage, and we have chosen a very simple symbol, which is the tree of life, something that is very central to Hinduism and much of Buddhism. And the building itself rises very much like organic living thing out of the ground. The building itself is not a building, it's a landscape, and the building conducts itself very much like a living organism. Here you can see an image of it, right? Like art day. This fog, this mist is very important to the sustainability concept that we have. The site plan, which we derived from the rings of growth, you can see here, is orienting itself to create a very central inner space, a kind of cosmic center to the scheme. And the residential towers organize themselves like a vertical village. On the very top we have a sky garden, and at intermediate levels we have streets that link together the social spaces that we want to bring up into the building. In other words, we are replacing the space that has been displaced by urban development with more green and with more social spaces to keep the cultural spirit of the people alive. So after quite a few studies in terms of the dynamics of the site and the climatic factors, we have also innovatively asked the developer to use the building as a rainwater collection device. Now this is something very important. Delhi has great temperature differentials. You're looking at something at 2-3 degrees in the winter time, but you have climate extremes of 50 degrees centigrade in the summertime. So water harvesting is a big thing for mitigating the environment. So the building actually looks like a tree which collects water and brings water down into the rainwater harvesting tanks below. The rooftop landscape is a garden and is the community space where the residents will congregate. And this is some views of the top of the building, which we use as community social space. We have a clubhouse there with separation of men and the women into 2 social spaces. And in the intermediate levels, we have community gardens for the children and for the multi-generational families that we have living here. So, one other thing which we had to deal with was the cultural issue. Buildings in India, some of you may know this, is very sensitive to Vastu, the traditional Indian way of looking at the world, a cosmogenic view of the universe. We wanted to do an architecture that was very inclusive. We had to take into account these social sensitivities and these traditional values. So if you're wondering why the shape of the units are the way they are, by the time you're done dealing with all the Vastu concerns, this is what you end up with, and it's immutable. Immutable is the word. It's a design of the unit, the airflow through the units, a simple site plan that shows the arrangement of the inner court, and in this beautiful inner court is really a whole host of environmental technologies that are designed to actually make the landscape sustainable. We are collecting the moisture from the air, both the rainwater and the winter mist, into rainwater harvesting tanks below. That black line shows the car park in the basement, and that 1 meter line shows the landscape where we are actually growing environmental tech. So here you are in the central garden. These are the dew collectors, which are also trellised pavilions. And you can see here how you come in from the main street where the MRT station, the Mass Rapid Transit, come into the intersection of the West Central Precinct. Main entry, building as a boulevard as you come in. That's the clubhouse, also designed as a rainwater harvesting structure in form of the Tree of Life. Swimming pools for the residents. And the one interesting central court where we have the swimming pool areas within the clubhouse. So it's very important to realize that cultural activity is going to be the heart and soul of this place. This is the Holy Festival, a festival of color, which has just passed last month. And we envisage that this community that we're actually building will be a lively community filled with both traditional values and contemporary life. So with that, thank you very much. I just wanted to close by saying that I think that as architects, urbanists, and designers, all of us have a responsibility to bring together the future and the past, and in places where there aren't enough policies and governmental infrastructure to create livable cities, we really have an opportunity to, from private development angle, to really create places that addresses these shortfalls. Thank you very much.
So interesting to bring that perspective. Thank you so much. Now, I did say that you were the last speaker, and that is unfortunately true because piano has a broken art running in land, breaking his arm, and obviously now, so you're going to have to meet Piero. Now, I just want to say a word or two about Piero works in but it's also an EU project, working.
Can't hear you.
Can you not?
No, sorry.
Better? Better? Can you hear me now? Okay. So all that to say that Piero, who would have been the next speaker, unfortunately can't be here because he's broken his arm or hand to outrunning the lab. So we're going to miss him, but he will be into the programme, both from the point of view of the super extensive work he's on the lab, and we're hoping to take some of that further into the programme. But also because Piero is project manager of the EU Open Data Sharing project, which is some of what I talked about earlier, which is developing open data sharing platforms in Milan, but is actually working very closely with the GLA and your colleagues on that project, and also Greenwich Council, part of that EU data, and we're working to bring some of that to the European projects as well. But we'll communicate to you about that after today, so Piero and his last unfortunately. So that's that. So we're going to break for lunch in just 1 minute. So just a couple of housekeeping thoughts. So please do go out and visit the stand. We've got our partners from SSAB. We've also got the startup guide that we just produced for the Mayor of London and a bunch of our partners, Future Cities Capital, Department of International Trade, other partners. The sale out there is £16 guide. And it's basically your Lonely Planet guide to the startup scene in London. So you can find it outside. And I know Leighton wants to make a quick announcement for a super experience outside. But before that, please continue to ask questions on Sli.do. Please continue to tweet #SmarterCitiesNow. And when you do go out for lunch, you need to have registered for today in order to get the wristband. And with that wristband, you can go to the cafe and get your free lunch, but you must have registered because you know something else free lunch. I'll repeat that in just 1 second, but let me just hand over to Leighton real quick to make
research here, and what I'm going to do in the corner over there is I'm actually going to show some of Leighton's architectural designs in holographic form. We'll be able to put on this little headset, and we're going to project buildings into the space, and you'll be able to walk around them, and we'll be able to look at them, and put 2 or 3 designs down so you can see an example of how architecture is probably going to be worked with in the future. Not on machines, but as light actually in the real world that you can work with directly. So if any of you want to come and have an experience of that, then I'll be demonstrating over there on the corner on